The humidity of the briefing room at Creech Air Force Base was a physical weight against Chief Warrant Officer Elena Vance's skin when she walked in at 0314, her left hand steady on the leather lead of a dog that technically did not have the clearance to be there. The air smelled of ozone, burnt coffee, and the sterile, metallic scent of industrial-grade air filters struggling against the Nevada dust. It was a Tuesday, the kind of morning that felt like it had been carved out of the middle of a long, cold night, and the men gathered around the mahogany table in the Secure Compartmented Information Facility, or SIF, were already on their second pots of caffeine. Elena didn't look at them. She didn't look at the maps glowing on the wall or the encrypted feeds scrolling in green and white text across the primary monitors. She looked at the floor, focusing on the way the light reflected off the polished linoleum, and she felt the slight, rhythmic pull of the black Labrador at her side. Boomer wasn't a standard-issue Belgian Malinois or a German Shepherd with a bite force designed to crush bone. He was a 70-pound rescue with a coat the color of a coal mine and eyes that seemed to hold a quiet, ancient intelligence. To the men in the room, he was a medical necessity, a symptom of the blast in Kandahar that had nearly ended Elena's career and left her with a permanent ringing in her ears and a sensitivity to light that forced her to wear tinted aviators even indoors. To them, the dog was a crutch, a visible mark of her brokenness. Colonel Marcus Holloway didn't look up from his tablet when Elena took her seat at the far end of the table, as far from the center of power as she could get without standing in the hallway. Holloway was a man who smelled of starch and expensive aftershave, a career officer who had managed to climb the ranks of intelligence and security command by knowing exactly which way the political wind was blowing. He had been the one to sign Elena's medical waiver, and he had done it with the kind of performative sympathy that made her teeth ache. He viewed her as a legacy project, a highly decorated sergeant officer who was being allowed to finish her 20 years in a quiet corner of the Nevada desert because the Army didn't want the bad PR of discharging a hero for a traumatic brain injury. He didn't know that the TBI hadn't just taken things away from her. It had rewired her. It had turned the world into a series of vibrations and patterns that she could feel in the marrow of her bones. Elena grew up in a town called Alpena, Michigan, tucked up against the edge of Lake Huron. It was a place where the wind sounded like a freight train 6 months out of the year, and the silence of the winter woods was so profound it felt like a physical presence. Her father had been a piano tuner, a man who could detect a deviation of a single vibration in a middle C string just by the way the air felt against his cheek. He had taught her how to listen, not just with her ears, but with her hands and her chest. By the time she was 10, she could tell which window in their house was unlatched just by the change in the house's resonance when the wind shifted. She had joined the Army because she wanted to find a place where that kind of focus mattered, and for 15 years it had. She had been the one who found the ghost frequencies in the mountains of the Hindu Kush, the signals that shouldn't have existed, the whispers of data that led to the capture of high-value targets. She had been a surgeon of the electromagnetic spectrum. Then came the IED outside of Bagram, the flash of white light, and the world falling into a chaotic, screaming jumble of noise that had taken her 3 years to sort back into a symphony. In the SIF, the meeting was about the Ouroboros anomaly. For 3 weeks, the task force had been tracking a series of intermittent signal drops in the secure uplink between Creech and the satellite array at Buckley Space Force Base in Colorado. The drops were less than a millisecond long, so fast the automated systems were flagging them as atmospheric interference or minor hardware glitches. But the frequency of the glitches was increasing. Holloway and his team of analysts, mostly young captains with Ivy League degrees and clean uniforms, were convinced it was a software conflict stemming from a recent firmware update in the primary encryption hubs. They were looking for a bug in the code. Elena, sitting in the corner with Boomer resting his chin on her boot, knew they were looking for a ghost in the wrong graveyard. She had felt the first drop 4 nights ago. She hadn't been looking at a screen. She had been sitting in her small, cramped office 3 levels down, drinking a cup of tepid water when the hum of the fluorescent lights changed. It was a shift so subtle that no instrument on the base had recorded it, but the hair on her arms had stood up. Boomer, who had been sleeping in his crate, had suddenly sat up and stared at the wall. Since the blast, the dog had become her external hard drive. He didn't just alert her to the onset of the migraines that preceded her seizures. He reacted to the things she felt but couldn't quite name. When she felt a spike in the local electromagnetic field, Boomer's ears would twitch. When a signal was being jammed nearby, he would pace. He was an extension of her own rewired nervous system, a biological sensor tuned to the same strange frequency she now inhabited. "Chief Vance," Holloway said, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the room. He didn't look at her, but the way he said her rank had a sharp, condescending edge. "Since you've graced us with your presence and your companion, do you have the SIGINT logs from the last 12 hours, or were you too busy with the grooming schedule?" A few of the younger officers chuckled, a dry, nervous sound. Elena didn't react. She didn't flush, and she didn't tighten her grip on the leash. She reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of physical printouts. She didn't use the digital tablet provided to her. The refresh rate of the screen often triggered a flicker vertigo that she preferred to avoid. She slid the papers across the table. They were covered in handwritten notations, small, precise symbols that looked more like musical scores than technical data. "The signal drops aren't software, Colonel," Elena said. Her voice was low and steady, the voice of a woman who had spent a decade talking pilots through combat landings. "They're physical. They're being triggered by a localized power draw that's bypassing the primary breakers. It's not a glitch in the code, it's an extraction." Holloway finally looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "An extraction? We're in a SIF, Vance. This room is a Faraday cage built inside a concrete bunker. The only thing moving in or out of here is encrypted through a triple redundant fiber optic line that is monitored 24 hours a day by the NSA. Are you suggesting someone is walking in here with a thumb drive and we're just missing it?" "No," Elena said. She looked at Boomer. The dog was still, his tail tucked neatly against his flank, but his eyes were fixed on the cooling vent in the far corner of the ceiling. "I'm saying the extraction is happening through the power grid itself. Someone is using the copper wiring in the walls as a low-frequency antenna. They're modulating the building's base resonance to carry data out through the grounding wires. It's why the drops only happen when the HVAC system kicks over to the secondary compressors. The extra load masks the signature." The silence that followed was heavy with the smell of skepticism. Captain Miller, a thin man with glasses who headed the technical team, leaned forward. "Chief, that's theoretically possible in a laboratory setting, maybe. But the sheer volume of data we're talking about, to mask that in the power hum of a military installation, you'd need a processing power that doesn't exist in a portable form, and you'd need a receiver close enough to catch a signal that weak. We sweep the perimeter every 4 hours. There's nothing out there but sand and rattlesnakes. The receiver doesn't have to be outside," Elena said. "Then where is it?" Holloway asked, his voice dripping with faux patience. "Is it in the dog's collar? Is it in your glasses, Vance? Give me something besides a feeling from your Michigan woodsman's intuition." Elena felt the familiar spike of heat behind her eyes, the beginning of the pressure that usually signaled a long afternoon of darkness and ice packs. She breathed through it, a slow, controlled inhale that hit the back of her throat and steadied her heart. She didn't need him to believe her to know she was right. She had seen the pattern. The drops weren't random. They followed the Fibonacci sequence, a mathematical signature that appeared in nature, in the spiral of a shell, the arrangement of leaves, and apparently in the theft of American state secrets. It was too elegant to be an accident. "I'm not asking you to take my word for it," Elena said. "I'm asking you to look at the power consumption logs for sub-basement 4, not the averages. Look at the raw wave form. Look at the troughs, not the peaks. We don't have time for a scavenger hunt in the basement, Chief," Holloway said, turning back to his tablet. "We have a briefing with General Sheridan in 2 hours. We need a solution for the satellite uplink, not a ghost story about the wiring." Dismissed. Elena stood. She didn't argue. She didn't point out that she had been the one who predicted the 2014 blackout in Talon before the first server went down. She didn't tell him that she could feel the room vibrating at a frequency of 62. 4 hertz, which was exactly 2. 4 hertz higher than the standard American power grid should be. She just signaled to Boomer and walked out. As the heavy, pressurized door of the SIF hissed shut behind her, she didn't head for the elevators. She headed for the stairs. The base at Creech was a sprawling labyrinth of Cold War-era concrete and modern glass, a place where the old world of physical security met the new world of digital warfare. Sub-Basement 4 was a relic, a level that had once housed the main cooling plants for the early drone programs. Now, it was mostly used for storage and the massive backup generators that kept the base alive during the frequent Nevada thunderstorms. The air in the stairwell was cooler, smelling of damp stone and the faint, sweet scent of hydraulic fluid. Boomer's nails clicked rhythmically on the metal grates, a sound that Elena found more comforting than the silence. She reached the bottom level and pushed open the door. The lights here were dim, flickering with a low-frequency buzz that made her vision swim for a second. She stopped, leaning her hand against the wall, and waited for her brain to catch up. "Easy, girl," she whispered to herself, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to herself or the dog. Boomer wasn't looking at her. He was standing in the middle of the corridor, his head cocked to the side. He gave a low, barely audible woof, a sound that was more of an exhaled breath than a bark. Elena followed him. They passed rows of crates, old server racks covered in plastic, and a graveyard of decommissioned monitors. The further they went, the more Elena felt it. It wasn't a sound. It was a pressure in her sinuses, a tightness in her chest that pulsed in time with the flickering of the lights. They reached the main power distribution hub for the sector. It was a massive steel cabinet, the size of a shipping container, hummed with the force of the electricity flowing through it. Elena pulled a handheld spectrum analyzer from her belt, not the fancy, government-issued one, but a modified piece of kit she'd built herself from salvaged parts. She held it near the primary grounding cable. The screen blossomed into a chaotic mess of jagged lines. She frowned. It wasn't just data. It was a heartbeat. She knelt down, her knees popping in the quiet of the basement. Boomer moved closer, his warm flank pressing against her shoulder. It was a grounding ritual they had practiced 1,000 times. His weight kept her present. His warmth kept the cold, metallic edges of her perception from overwhelming her. She closed her eyes and reached out, not touching the humming steel, but hovering her hand inches away from the cable. She could feel the heat. Not just the heat of friction, but a specific modulated warmth. Someone had tapped into the line. It wasn't a physical tap, not a wire spliced into a wire. It was an induction coil, something that sat on the outside of the cable and bled off the data through the electromagnetic field. It was sophisticated, it was clean, and it was active. Suddenly, Boomer's body went rigid. A low growl started deep in his chest, a sound so primal it made the hair on Elena's neck stand up. She opened her eyes. The dog wasn't looking at the power hub. He was looking at the shadows behind the old generator units. Elena didn't move. She didn't reach for the sidearm she wasn't technically supposed to carry in the sub-basements. She just watched. A shadow moved. It wasn't a person. It was a drone, small, no larger than a dragonfly, hovering with a silent, terrifying grace. It wasn't a standard military model. It was matte black, with 4 rotors that moved so fast they were invisible, and a single, glowing red eye that stared directly at her. The drone didn't attack. It hovered for 3 seconds, its sensor swept over Elena and the dog, and then it zipped upward, disappearing into the maze of pipes and ductwork near the ceiling. "Shit," Elena breathed. She stood up, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The presence of the drone changed everything. This wasn't a remote extraction. This was an active, on-site breach. Someone was in the building, or very, very close to it. She looked at Boomer. The dog was still tracking something she couldn't see, his eyes moving rapidly across the ceiling. She needed to get back to the SIF. She needed to tell Holloway. Even if he didn't believe her, she had to try. She turned to the door, but as she did, the lights in the corridor didn't just flicker. They went out. The darkness was absolute, the kind of darkness that only exists deep underground. For a moment, the silence was even worse. No hum of the power hub, no buzz of the lights, just the sound of her own breathing and the soft, steady panting of the dog. Then the secondary emergency lights kicked in, a dim, sickly red glow that cast long, distorted shadows across the floor. Elena's radio crackled. All units, we have a Tier 1 power failure in sectors Alpha through Delta. Initiate lockdown procedures. This is not a drill." The voice on the radio was Captain Miller's, but it was pitched an octave higher than usual, tight with a panic he was trying to hide. Elena didn't wait for more. She ran. She didn't go back to the stairs. Those would be the first things the security teams would swamp. She knew a service elevator in the back of the cooling plant that ran on a completely separate manual override circuit. It was old, slow, and loud, but it would get her to the 3rd floor. As she ran, the weight of her gear, the radio, the analyzer, the heavy leather of her boots, felt like it was pulling her into the floor. Her TBI-related vertigo flared, the red lights of the hallway blurring into long, bloody streaks. She felt the world tilt, her balance sliding away from her. Boomer felt it too. He didn't stop, but he moved closer, his shoulder bumping into her leg with every 3rd step, a rhythmic reminder of where the ground was. They reached the service elevator. Elena slammed her palm against the call button. Nothing. She hit it again harder, her controlled rage finally bubbling to the surface. This was exactly what she had warned them about. The extraction wasn't the goal, the extraction was the diversion. The power failure was the real attack. The elevator doors groaned open. The car was a small, cage-like affair, smelling of grease and old cigarettes. She stepped in, Boomer at her heels, and pulled the manual lever. The car shuddered and began to rise with a grind of metal on metal that felt like it was tearing through her skull. She leaned her head against the cool, steel wall of the elevator. The ringing in her ears was back, a high-pitched whine that drowned out the sound of the engine. She closed her eyes and tried to visualize the base's architecture. If the power was out in sectors Alpha through Delta, that meant the SIF was on battery backup. The satellite uplink would be dead. The drone feeds would be dark. The base would be blind. The elevator stopped with a bone-jarring thud. Elena pried the doors open. She was on the third floor, the administrative level. It should have been a hive of activity, but the hallway was empty. The red emergency lights pulsed slowly, like a dying heart. She stepped out, her hand on Boomer's collar. "Stay close," she whispered. She made it halfway to the SIF before she heard the voices. They weren't the voices of the security teams. They were quiet, measured, and they were coming from the briefing room she had just left. She flattened herself against the wall, her heart jumping in her throat. She looked at Boomer. The dog was low to the ground, his hackles raised, his lips pulled back just enough to show the white of his teeth. She peeked around the corner. 2 men were standing outside the SIF door. They weren't wearing U.S. military uniforms. They were wearing dark, tactical gear with no markings, and they were holding short-barreled submachine guns with suppressors the size of soda cans. They weren't looking for someone to fight. They were waiting. One of the men checked his watch. He said something into a headset in a language Elena didn't recognize, not Russian, not Arabic. It sounded tonal, sharp. She backed away, her mind racing. The SIF was the most secure room on the base, but it was also a trap. Once the power went out and the electronic locks engaged, the people inside were sealed in. The only way out was a manual override from the outside or an explosive charge. She realized then that Holloway and the others weren't the targets. They were the leverage. Elena felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over her. This was the dark competence her instructors had talked about at Fort Huachuca, the moment when the fear doesn't disappear, but it becomes a tool. The world narrowed down to the hallway, the 2 men, and the dog at her side. She didn't have a rifle. She had a spectrum analyzer, a flashlight, and a 70-pound lab who had been trained to stay calm during thunderstorms. But she also had the building's layout, and she knew something the men in the hallway didn't. She knew that the HVAC ducts in this sector were oversized because of the old server heat loads. She looked at Boomer. "You ready to go for a crawl, buddy?" The dog tilted his head, his tail giving a single tentative wag. She found the maintenance hatch in the janitor's closet 20 feet back. It was small, dusty, and smelled of lemon-scented floor wax. She boosted Boomer up first, the dog scrambling into the galvanized steel duct with a quiet efficiency that made her throat tighten with pride. She followed him, the metal groaning under her weight. It was a tight fit, the space smelling of stale air and old dust. She crawled on her elbows, the rough metal scraping her skin, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. They moved slowly, Elena following the sound of Boomer's breathing. The ductwork acted like a megaphone, carrying the sounds of the base to her. She heard the distant shout of a security team, the rhythmic thud of boots on stairs, and then a sound that made her freeze. The sound of a drill. They were drilling into the SIF's manual override lock. She reached the vent directly above the SIF entrance. Through the slats, she could see the 2 men. One was kneeling by the door, a high-speed diamond bit drill in his hand. The other was standing guard, his weapon swept in a slow, professional arc. Elena reached into her pocket. She didn't have a grenade. She had a flare, a high-intensity magnesium emergency light she'd taken from the sub-basement. It wouldn't kill them, but in the red-lit darkness of the hallway, it would be like a small sun exploding. She looked at Boomer. She needed him to be her distraction. She whispered a command into his ear, a specific word they had only used in training. It was a command to find the toy, but with an intensity that told him this was the most important toy in the world. She kicked the vent cover. It hit the floor with a loud, metallic clang. The guard spun, his weapon tracking upward. In the same second, Elena shoved Boomer through the opening. The dog didn't fall, he launched. 70 pounds of muscle and black fur hit the guard's chest with the force of a linebacker. The man went down, his weapon firing a single muffled shot into the ceiling. Elena dropped down right behind the dog. She didn't land gracefully. She hit the floor hard, the shock vibrating through her teeth. The man with the drill was reaching for his sidearm. Elena didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She slammed the magnesium flare against the floor and threw it. The world vanished in a blinding, terrifying wall of white light. Elena squeezed her eyes shut, but even through her eyelids the light was a physical pain. She heard a scream, a raw, guttural sound of a man whose retinas had just been scorched. She heard Boomer growling, the sound of tearing fabric, and the heavy thud of a body hitting the wall. She scrambled forward, her hands searching the floor until they found the guard's dropped submachine gun. It felt cold and heavy in her hands, a familiar weight that she hadn't felt in years. She stood up, her vision still swimming with purple and green ghosts from the flare. "Don't move!" she screamed, her voice echoing in the narrow hallway. The man with the drill was on the floor, clutching his face, his weapon 10 feet away. The guard was pinned under Boomer, the dog's jaws locked onto the man's tactical vest, shaking him with a silent, terrifying fury. The light from the flare began to fade, leaving the hallway in a thick, smoky haze. Elena stood over them, the submachine gun leveled at the man with the drill. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was slow. The ringing in her ears was gone, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like the center of a storm. The SIF door groaned. The manual override had been partially engaged before the light went off. The door slid open 6 inches, and Holloway's pale face appeared in the gap. He looked at the smoking flare, the 2 men on the floor, and then at Elena, a woman he had dismissed as broken, standing in the middle of a war zone with a weapon in her hand and a dog at her throat. "Vance," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Get back inside, Colonel," Elena said, her eyes never leaving the men on the floor. "And call the MPs. Tell them we have guests." Holloway didn't move for a second. He looked at the dog, who was now sitting calmly on the guard's chest, his tail wagging once as if to say, "Is this what you wanted?" The dog, Holloway stammered. He found them?" "No," Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper that only the colonel could hear. "He didn't find them, he just knew I was right." She felt the cost of the moment then, the way her knees wanted to buckle, the way the pressure in her head was building into a roar. She had saved the room, but she had exposed herself. The secret of what she could do, of the way she and the dog moved through the world, was no longer a secret. She had traded her invisibility for their lives. As the sound of sirens began to wail in the distance and the heavy boots of the MP teams rounded the corner, Elena didn't look at the medals she knew were coming. She didn't look at the men she had defeated. She looked at Boomer. The dog looked back, his tongue lolling out in a goofy, satisfied grin. "Good boy," she whispered. But as the first MP reached her and reached for the weapon, Elena's vision suddenly fractured. The red emergency lights didn't just pulse. They shattered into a million points of light. She felt her body begin to tilt, the floor rushing up to meet her. She didn't feel the impact. She only felt the warmth of Boomer's fur as he moved to catch her, and the sudden, terrifying realization that the drone she had seen in the basement hadn't been working alone. In the last second before the darkness took her, she heard it. A sound that shouldn't have been there. A low, rhythmic tapping coming from inside the SIF walls. The extraction wasn't over. It was just getting started. Elena woke up 3 hours later in the base infirmary, the smell of antiseptic and floor wax a sharp, unpleasant greeting. Her head felt like it had been cracked open and filled with hot lead. The room was dim, the blinds pulled tight against the Nevada sun, but she could still feel the light pressing against her eyes. "Chief!" The voice was soft. Elena turned her head slowly. Boomer was there, his chin resting on the edge of the cot, his tail thumping rhythmically against the metal leg. Beside him sat Captain Miller. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. His tie was loose and his glasses were smudged. "Where are they?" Elena's voice was a dry rasp. "The 2 from the hallway? In custody. They're not talking yet, but their prints aren't in any Western database. We're thinking corporate extraction or a very high-end mercenary group." Miller leaned forward, his expression a mix of awe and something that looked like fear. "Vance, the colonel is telling everyone you took them down single-handedly. He's already drafting a Silver Star recommendation." Elena closed her eyes. "I don't want a star, Miller. I want the power logs for the SIF, the internal ones from the last 10 minutes. Miller hesitated. "The base is still on lockdown. Holloway is with the general. They think the threat is contained." "It's not," Elena said, her voice gaining a sharp, cold edge. She sat up, the world spinning for a nauseating moment before it settled. She grabbed Boomer's collar, pulling him closer. "The drone, Miller. I saw a drone in the sub-basement. It wasn't there to watch me. It was there to calibrate." "Calibrate what?" "The resonance," Elena said, her mind racing through the patterns she had felt before the blackout. They weren't just stealing data. They were planting something, a physical virus, something that lives in the vibrations of the hardware. She stood up, her legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. She didn't have her boots. She was in her socks, her uniform wrinkled and stained with dust. She didn't care. "Miller, if they planted a harmonic resonator in the SIF's primary cooling lines, they don't need a drone to steal the data anymore. They just need the base to turn the power back on." Miller's face went pale. "The general just gave the order to re-engage the main grid 5 minutes ago." Elena didn't wait. She grabbed her aviators from the bedside table and headed for the door, the dog trotting at her side. She didn't have a weapon and she didn't have a plan. All she had was a ringing in her ears that was growing louder with every passing second, a sound that she finally recognized for what it was. It wasn't a ringing. It was a countdown. She burst into the hallway, the light of the facility hitting her like a physical blow. She didn't head for the SIF. She headed for the main breaker room 3 levels down. As she ran, she felt the first surge of power hit the building. It was a low, guttural growl that started in the floors and rose up through the walls. Boomer stopped suddenly, his head snapping toward the ceiling. He let out a bark, not a play bark, but the sharp, urgent alert he used when a seizure was seconds away. Elena felt it too. The air in the hallway began to shimmer. The sound was no longer in her head. It was in the air. A high-pitched crystalline shriek that made the glass in the fire extinguisher cabinets begin to vibrate. "Miller," she screamed back at the captain who was struggling to keep up. "Call the control room, tell them to cut the load now." But she knew it was too late. The harmonic had reached its peak. She reached the door to the breaker room and threw it open. The smell of ozone was overwhelming now, thick enough to taste. In the center of the room, the massive transformers were glowing with a faint blue light. And there, attached to the main bus bar, was a small black box, no bigger than a pack of cigarettes, humming with a terrifying, rhythmic intensity. Elena didn't stop to think about the voltage. She didn't think about the risk. She saw the pattern. The box was pulsing in time with the base's heartbeat. If she didn't break the cycle, the entire electrical infrastructure of the base would shatter, turning the SIF into a microwave and the data inside into ash. She looked at Boomer. The dog was backing away, his fur standing on end from the static in the air. "Stay," she commanded. She reached for the box. Her hand was inches away when the world finally, mercifully, exploded into white. But this time it wasn't a flare. It was the sound of the entire base screaming at once. Elena felt the jolt of electricity sear through her arm, a white-hot agony that bypassed her nerves and went straight to her soul. She felt her heart stop. She felt the silence of the Michigan woods. And then she felt a pair of teeth sink into the sleeve of her jacket, a powerful, desperate weight pulling her back, away from the light, away from the hum, and into the cool, dark safety of the shadows. She hit the floor, her heart kick-starting with a violent, agonizing thud. The blue light was gone. The humming had stopped. The only sound was the heavy, frantic panting of a dog who had just saved her life for the second time in 4 hours. Elena lay there for a long time, the taste of copper in her mouth and the smell of singed hair in her nostrils. She looked up at the ceiling, her vision slowly returning to the red-tinted world she knew. She had stopped it. The box was charred, a melted lump of plastic on the floor. The base was dark again. The data was safe. But as she reached out to touch Boomer's head, her hand trembling, she saw the one thing she hadn't expected. On the wall, right above the transformer, was a small, hand-painted symbol. It wasn't a military marking. It wasn't a corporate logo. It was a small, elegant bird, a hummingbird frozen in flight. Elena felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She knew that symbol. She had seen it once before, in a classified file she wasn't supposed to have access to. It was the mark of a program that didn't exist, a program that was supposed to have been shut down 20 years ago. The threat wasn't coming from the outside. It was coming from the very people she served. She looked at the dog, his eyes glowing in the dim emergency light. He knew. He had always known. "We have to go," Elena whispered, her voice barely a breath. "We can't stay here." She stood up, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. She didn't look back at the breaker room. She didn't look back at the life she had spent 20 years building. She just walked toward the exit, her hand steady on the leash, the dog moving at her side with a quiet, lethal grace. The door to the outside world was heavy, but when she pushed it open, the Nevada air felt like a benediction. The desert was vast, silent, and indifferent to the games of men. Elena looked out at the horizon, where the first hint of dawn was beginning to bleed into the sky. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know how she would survive. But as Boomer looked up at her, his tail giving a single, confident wag, Elena Vance realized for the first time in years that she wasn't broken. She was finally completely awake. She stepped out into the sand, her silhouette disappearing into the long shadows of the morning. A woman and her dog walking away from a war that no one else even knew had begun. The sand was still cold enough to leach the heat from the soles of her socks when the first pair of headlights cut through the pre-dawn haze of the Nevada desert. Elena didn't stop walking. Her boots were back in the breaker room, likely melted to the linoleum or discarded as forensic evidence. But the grit against her skin felt honest in a way the air-conditioned lies of the base did not. Boomer stayed at her left hip, his pace perfectly synchronized with hers, his tail low and alert. Behind them, the sprawling silhouette of Creech Air Force Base sat like a dormant beast, its perimeter lights flickering back to life as the auxiliary grid stabilized. To anyone watching from the towers, she was a ghost in a flight suit, a fragment of the night refusing to dissolve into the morning. The headlights belonged to a Chevy Tahoe with the low-profile light bar of the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. It didn't scream toward her. It approached with a predatory patience, the engine a low, rhythmic growl that Elena felt in the base of her skull. She stopped 10 yards before the vehicle reached her. She didn't raise her hands. She didn't reach for a weapon she no longer carried. She simply stood, her silhouette framed by the purple-gray sky, and waited for the system to reclaim her. 2 men stepped out. They weren't the MPs she had seen earlier. They wore charcoal suits that looked too heavy for the desert heat, and the kind of expressions that suggested they had already decided what the truth was before they spoke to her. The driver, a man with a jaw like a cinder block and eyes the color of slate, didn't look at Elena. He looked at Boomer. "Chief Warrant Officer Vance," the man said. His voice was a flat, Midwestern baritone, devoid of the adrenaline that had fueled the last 4 hours. "I'm Special Agent Miller, not the Captain Miller you know. We're here to take you to the medical wing at Nellie's. You've had a significant neurological event." "I had a mission," Elena said. Her voice sounded thin to her own ears, like wire being stretched to the breaking point. "The mission is incomplete. The sub-basement 4 distribution hub was compromised by an internal asset. There was a hummingbird symbol. You need to secure the site before the cleanup crew arrives." Agent Miller didn't write anything down. He didn't even blink. "You were found unconscious in the breaker room after a massive electrical surge, Chief. You saved a lot of lives today, but you're also suffering from a grade 3 concussion and potential electromagnetic poisoning. The things you think you saw, the symbols, the drones, the doctors call those sensory echoes. It's a common side effect of the TBI when triggered by high-voltage exposure." Elena felt the first spark of the controlled rage she had spent years tempering. It wasn't the heat of an explosion. It was the cold, pressurized center of a deep-sea trench. They weren't accusing her of lying. They were patronizing her. They were using the very injury she had received in service to the country to invalidate the evidence of her own eyes. "The dog saw it too," she said, her voice dropping an octave. Miller looked at Boomer again. The lab was staring at him, his ears forward, his body a silent statue of focused intent. "The dog is trained to react to your physiological shifts, Vance. If you're seeing ghosts, he's going to bark at the air. That's what he's paid for. Now get in the car. We can do this the hero way, or we can do this the medical hold way. Either way, you're leaving the base." Elena looked back at the base. She could feel it, a faint, lingering vibration in the ground, a subaudible frequency that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't an echo, it was a live feed. The hummingbird wasn't a ghost, it was a signature. She looked at Boomer, and for a split second she saw the same thing in his eyes that she felt in her marrow. He knew. She got into the back of the Tahoe. The drive to Nellie's Air Force Base took 45 minutes. Most of it was spent in a silence so thick it felt like physical weight. Elena sat with her hand resting on Boomer's head, her fingers tracing the soft velvet of his ears. He was her anchor. When the world began to tilt, when the TBI made the horizon line feel like it was sliding off the map, the weight of his head against her knee was the only thing that kept her upright. She thought back to the day she had found him. It was 3 years ago at a specialized facility in San Antonio that salvaged dogs too unpredictable for standard patrol work. Boomer had been a washout from an EOD program. They said he was too sensitive. He would alert on things that weren't there. He would pace before the storms arrived. They called him broken. Elena had walked into his kennel, sat on the floor, and waited. He hadn't barked. He hadn't jumped. He had simply walked over and pressed his forehead against hers, and in that moment she had felt a resonance so pure it had brought her to tears. Two broken things finding a shared frequency. At Nellie's, the treatment was different. There were no silver stars or handshakes. She was ushered through a back entrance of the hospital, bypassing the main lobby and taken to a private wing that smelled of ozone and industrial-strength floor wax. They took Boomer. That was the first moment she almost lost her control. "He stays with me," she said, her hand tightening on the lead as a young orderly reached for it. "Hospital policy, Chief," Agent Miller said, appearing in the doorway. "He needs a decontamination sweep anyway. You were both exposed to the ozone discharge. He'll be in the kennel bay 50 yards away. You'll see him in the morning." "He stays," Elena repeated. Her heart rate began to climb, a sharp, jagged rhythm she could see on the monitor the nurse was already attaching to her arm. "He's a certified medical service animal. You separate us and my seizure threshold drops by 60%. Is that on your report, Agent?" Miller looked at the nurse, then back at Elena. He saw the way her eyes were beginning to track the flickering of the fluorescent lights above. He knew that if she had a grand mal seizure in his custody, the paperwork would be a nightmare that even the Pentagon couldn't bury. "Fine," Miller muttered. "He stays in the room, but he stays on the floor." The next 6 hours were a blur of cold gel, clicking MRI machines, and the repetitive, droning voices of doctors who spoke about her as if she weren't in the room. They analyzed the pathways of her brain, looking for the jagged scars left by the Kandahar blast, comparing them to the new data. They found what they expected to find: a brain that was working too hard to process too much. The hyperresonance she describes is a classic compensatory mechanism. A neurologist told a man Elena didn't recognize, a man in a sharp navy blazer who sat in the corner of the room. The TBI damaged her primary auditory cortex, so the brain is overutilizing the somatosensory system. She isn't hearing the power grid. Her brain is misinterpreting the physical vibration of the building as data. It's a sensory hallucination. High functioning, but a hallucination nonetheless. "And the drone?" the man in the blazer asked. He was older, with silver hair and the kind of tan that only came from expensive golf courses and even more expensive secrets. "Stress-induced," the doctor said. Coupled with the flicker vertigo from the emergency lights, she saw what her mind needed her to see to make sense of the power failure. Elena lay on the exam table, her eyes closed, Boomer's chin resting on the edge of the mattress. She heard every word. She also heard the sound of the man in the blazer's watch, a mechanical ticking that was slightly out of phase with the room's digital clock. She heard the way the HVAC system in the hospital hummed at a perfect 60 hertz, except for a tiny, microscopic skip every 14 seconds. The skip was the same pattern she had seen in the sub-basement, the Fibonacci skip. She didn't open her eyes, she didn't argue. She waited until the room cleared, until the only sound left was the rhythmic breathing of the dog and the distant, muffled sounds of the hospital corridor. She sat up, the movement sending a spike of white-hot needles through her temples. "Boomer," she whispered. The dog was up instantly, his eyes locked on hers. Elena reached into the pocket of her flight suit, which they had thankfully left on a chair near the bed. She pulled out the spectrum analyzer. It was dead, the screen cracked, and the internals likely fried by the surge in the breaker room. But she didn't need the screen. She pulled the back casing off with a fingernail, exposing the copper coils and the small, silver-plated capacitor she had soldered in herself. She held the capacitor against the base of her thumb, right over the pulse point. She closed her eyes and let the world go dark. She didn't listen for sounds. She listened for the *weight* of the air. If the hummingbird virus was real, and if it was moving through the power grid as she suspected, it would leave a wake. Like a boat moving through a still lake, the modulated data would create a ripple in the electromagnetic field that a sensitive enough receiver could pick up. She felt it. It wasn't a vibration. It was a tug. A tiny, rhythmic pull that synchronized with the skip in the HVAC system. It was here, in the hospital, in the walls. A soft knock on the door made her slip the analyzer back into her pocket. The door opened and a woman in a lab coat stepped in. She wasn't one of the doctors from before. She was younger, with dark hair pulled back in a messy bun and a pair of sensible glasses perched on her nose. She was carrying a tray with a plastic cup of water and 2 blue pills. "I'm Sarah," the woman said. I'm the night shift PA. How's the head, Chief? Like a construction site, Elena said, watching the woman carefully. Sarah smiled, a genuine, tired expression that didn't have the practiced sterility of the other staff. She set the tray down and looked at Boomer. He's a handsome guy. Lab pointer mix? Lab and something else, Elena said. The something else is the part that matters. Sarah nodded, leaning against the wall. She didn't look at the monitors or the chart. She looked at Elena's hands. You're shaking, Chief. That's the adrenaline wearing off. Or the neuro load. I've seen it in the drone pilots when they come back from a long rotation. Their brains are still at 10,000 feet while their bodies are in a chair in Nevada. This isn't drone lag, Elena said. She took a breath, a gamble forming in the back of her mind. Sarah, what happens to the equipment when the main grid at Nellie's fails? The backup generators, how long do they take to sync? Sarah frowned. I don't know. A few seconds, why? I need you to look at the power consumption logs for this wing. Just for the last hour, look for the ghost spikes, tiny ones less than half a watt. Sarah's expression shifted from polite concern to something more guarded. Chief, the doctors said you should rest. They're worried about another seizure. I know what they said, Elena said, her voice turning hard. They said I'm hallucinating. They said I'm a broken hero who needs a quiet room and a medical discharge. But they weren't in that basement. They didn't see the drone, and they don't know that the people who attacked Creech didn't come from the outside. Sarah stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. What do you mean they didn't come from the outside? The equipment they used, the induction coils, the Hummingbird's signature, that's not mercenary tech. That's domestic. That's Black Project hardware. Someone is using this base to field test a new kind of signal extraction, and they're using the power failure as a smokescreen to hide the fact that they've already moved the data. Sarah looked at the door, then back at Elena. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a smartphone. I shouldn't do this. My brother was a ranger, 2nd Battalion. He came back from a tour in Helmand, and nobody believed him about the things he saw in the valleys until it was too late. She tapped a few icons on the screen, her thumbs moving with a practiced speed. I have access to the facility management portal. It's for monitoring the meds fridges, but it shows the raw draw from the main breakers. She turned the screen toward Elena. Elena's heart skipped. There it was, a jagged, rhythmic pulse in the power wave. It wasn't a hardware glitch. It was a language, a complex, multi-layered data stream being piggybacked onto the 60 Hz AC cycle. It was moving through the hospital, using the wiring as a massive, building-wide antenna to broadcast a low-frequency signal to a satellite that shouldn't have been in that orbit. It's still active, Elena whispered. They're using the hospital's medical servers as a relay. Who? Sarah asked, her face pale. The Hummingbird, Elena said. The door to the room swung open with a violent thud. It wasn't Agent Miller. It was a man in a tactical vest, his face obscured by a gas mask. He didn't say a word. He didn't issue a command. He raised a suppressed pistol and fired. The sound was no louder than a dry branch snapping. The bullet hit the Roman 4 pole inches from Elena's head, sending a spray of shattered plastic and saline across the bed. Elena didn't scream. She didn't freeze. Her training, the dark competence that lived in the muscle memory of her soul, took over before her conscious mind could process the threat. She rolled off the far side of the bed, dragging the mattress with her as a makeshift shield. Boomer, red. The command was a trigger. The lab, who had been a quiet companion seconds ago, transformed into a 70-pound engine of destruction. He didn't bark. He launched himself across the room, a black blur that bypassed the shooter's weapon and went straight for the throat. The shooter tried to pivot, but the dog's weight hit him mid-chest. The man went down, his head hitting the edge of the metal cabinet with a sickening crack. Boomer didn't let go. He pinned the man's arm, his jaws locked onto the tactical sleeve, his body a low, growling wall of muscle. Elena scrambled to her feet, her vision swimming. She grabbed the heavy metal oxygen tank from the bedside rack and swung it with everything she had. The tank hit the shooter's wrist, and the suppressed pistol skittered across the floor. Sarah, get out! Elena yelled. The PA was huddled in the corner, her eyes wide with terror. She didn't move. She couldn't. Elena reached down and grabbed the pistol. It was a Glock 19, modified with a high-capacity magazine and a carbon fiber suppressor. No markings, no serial numbers, a sterile weapon. She looked at the man on the floor. He was unconscious, his breathing ragged behind the mask. She reached down and ripped the mask off. It wasn't a corporate mercenary. It was one of the orderlies she had seen in the hallway earlier. A man who had been wearing a hospital badge. A man who was supposed to be part of the system. Institutional failure, Elena whispered, the words tasting like ash. She realized then that the hospital wasn't a place of recovery. It was a kill box. They had brought her here to evaluate her, which really meant they had brought her here to be quietly removed once they realized she could feel the signal. Holloway, Miller, the man in the blazer, they weren't just covering up a mistake. They were part of the extraction. Sarah, Elena said, her voice cold and steady. She walked over to the woman and put a hand on her shoulder. Listen to me, you need to leave now. Go to the main lobby. Find the busiest place you can. Don't go to your car. Call the local police, not the MPs. Tell them there's an active shooter in the West Wing. Do it now. What about you? Sarah stammered. I'm going to finish the mission, Elena said. She didn't wait for a response. She grabbed her boots from the chair. Blessedly, someone had cleaned them and left them there and laced them up with trembling hands. She checked the Glock. 1 in the chamber, 15 in the mag. She looked at Boomer. The dog was standing by the door, his hackles raised, his eyes tracking something in the hallway. We have to move, buddy, she said. They stepped out into the corridor. The hospital was eerily quiet. The red emergency lights were back on, pulsing with that same sickly rhythm. Elena didn't head for the exit. She knew the exits would be covered. She headed for the basement, the heart of the hospital's server farm. If the signal was being relayed from here, that's where the hummingbird would be perched. As they moved through the labyrinthine halls, Elena felt the pressure in her head building. The signal was stronger here. It was a physical weight, a thrumming in her teeth that made her want to scream, but she used it. She followed the vibration like a bloodhound follows a scent. She didn't need a map, she just needed to follow the pain. They reached the heavy, reinforced door of the server room. It was locked with a biometric scanner. Elena looked at the panel, then at the unconscious man she had left behind in the room. She didn't have his thumb, but she did have the oxygen tank. She didn't use the tank. She looked at the wiring conduit above the door. Boomer watched the rear. She climbed onto a nearby laundry cart and reached into the ceiling tiles. Her hands were steady now, the adrenaline having reached a plateau of cold, sharp clarity. She found the primary data trunk. She didn't need to cut it. She needed to blind it. She pulled the spectrum analyzer from her pocket. It was dead, but the capacitor was still good. She stripped a section of the data cable with her teeth and pressed the capacitor against the wire. The shock was small, but the feedback was massive. Across the building, the lights flickered and died. The hum of the servers changed from a smooth purr to a high-pitched whine. Elena felt the signal fracture. The hummingbird was struggling. The door clicked open. Elena dropped from the cart and pushed inside. The server room was a forest of black towers, glowing with thousands of tiny, blinking lights. The air was frigid, the cooling fans roaring like a jet engine. In the center of the room was a single, non-standard rack. It wasn't bolted to the floor like the others. It was sitting on rubber pads, and it was covered in the same matte black shielding she had seen on the drone. And there it was, painted on the side of the rack in small, elegant white lines, the hummingbird. Elena approached it, the Glock leveled at the shadows. She reached out to touch the casing, but before she could, a voice cut through the roar of the fans. I wouldn't do that, Elena. The resonance in that casing is enough to stop your heart. She spun around. Standing at the far end of the row was Colonel Holloway. He wasn't wearing his uniform. He was in a tactical jacket, a weapon held loosely at his side. He looked tired. Not the tiredness of a man who had been up all night, but the tiredness of a man who had been carrying a lie for 20 years. Colonel, Elena said, her voice a low growl. I should have known you'd be the one to check the traps. It's not a trap, Elena, Holloway said. He didn't raise his weapon. He stayed where he was, his silhouette framed by the blue light of the servers. It's a necessity. You're a signal officer. You know the state of the world. We're losing the digital war. Our encryption is being cracked by quantum computers in Beijing and Moscow before the ink is dry on the orders. We needed a new way, a physical way. The hummingbird, Elena said. It's a kinetic data transfer system. You're using the national power grid as a closed-circuit network. No satellites to hack, no fiber to cut, just the resonance of the copper itself. It's the most secure communication network ever built, Holloway said, a hint of pride creeping into his voice. But it has a flaw. The resonance is so specific that it can be detected by certain biological anomalies. People like your father, people like you. So you decided to extract me, Elena asked, like a piece of data. We tried to bring you in, Elena. After Kandahar, we saw the shift in your neuro patterns. We knew you were tuned to the frequency. We wanted you to lead the project, but you were too loyal, too much of a good soldier. You would have asked questions about the legality, about the domestic surveillance implications. Holloway took a step forward. The men at Creech, they weren't mercenaries. They were a security team from the program. They were supposed to secure the hub and bring you to the facility. But you fought back. You used the dog. You broke the cycle. I saved those people, Elena said. You delayed the inevitable, Holloway countered. The data on that rack is the backbone of the next generation of American defense. If it's compromised, we're blind for a decade. I can't let you walk out of here with what you know, Elena. Not because I want to hurt you, but because the mission matters more than the individual. You taught me that. Elena looked at the hummingbird rack, then back at Holloway. She felt a wave of profound sadness. It wasn't for herself. It was for the institution. The system she had given her life to was so afraid of its own shadows that it was willing to devour its own heroes to keep them. The mission is built on the truth, Colonel, Elena said. If you have to lie to the people you're protecting, you're not a soldier anymore. You're just a jailer. Holloway's expression hardened. He raised his weapon. I'm sorry, Elena. I really am. But Holloway didn't fire. From the shadows behind him, a low, guttural roar erupted. It wasn't a bark. It was the sound of a predator claiming its kill. Boomer, who had been silent and invisible in the dark corners of the room, launched himself. He didn't go for Holloway's throat. He went for the weapon. The colonel fired, the shot echoing like a cannon blast in the confined space. Elena felt the wind of the bullet pass her cheek. She didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, not toward Holloway, but toward the hummingbird rack. She didn't use the Glock. She used the one thing she knew would break the resonance. She grabbed the heavy, copper grounding strap from the side of the server rack and ripped it free. The world didn't explode. It didn't flash white. Instead, the sound in the room changed. The high-pitched whine of the servers suddenly dropped into a deep, agonizing groan. The blue lights turned a violent, flickering red. Elena felt a surge of static electricity so powerful it made her hair stand on end, her skin crawling with 1,000 tiny needles. Holloway screamed, not from a physical wound, but from the sudden, catastrophic feedback of the system he had spent his career building. The resonance he had cultivated, the perfect signal, was collapsing back on itself. In the chaos, Elena saw Boomer and Holloway locked in a struggle on the floor. She scrambled over, her vision tunneling. She raised the Glock, her finger on the trigger, but she couldn't pull it. Even now, with the world falling apart, she couldn't execute a man who had once been her mentor. She slammed the butt of the pistol against Holloway's temple. The colonel went limp. Elena collapsed back against the server rack, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was spinning now, the red lights blurring into a single bloody smear. She felt the pressure in her head reach a crescendo, a roar that threatened to drown out her very soul. "Boomer," she croaked. The dog was at her side in an instant. He was bleeding, a shallow graze along his flank where Holloway's bullet had found him, but he was alive. He pressed his head against her shoulder, his warmth the only thing keeping her from slipping into the darkness. She looked at the hummingbird rack. It was dead. The glowing lights were dark, the fans silent. The data, the backbone of the program, was gone, wiped clean by the grounding surge she had triggered. She had won, but the cost was written in the silence of the room. She reached into Holloway's pocket and pulled out his encrypted comms unit. It was still active. A voice was crackling through the earpiece, a cold, distant voice she didn't recognize. "Holloway, status. We're seeing a total sync loss at Nellie's. Did you secure the asset?" Elena picked up the unit. She didn't speak. She just listened to the voice of the machine. "Holloway, respond. If the asset is compromised, initiate Protocol 9. We cannot allow a leak." Elena dropped the unit and crushed it under her boot. She looked at Boomer. The dog was watching the door, his ears twitching. He heard it before she did, the sound of heavy boots, dozens of them, moving through the basement corridors. The cleanup crew had arrived, and they weren't here to rescue her. Elena stood up, the weight of her gear and her history pulling at her like lead. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have a way out. All she had was a half-empty magazine, a wounded dog, and a truth that no one would ever believe. She looked at the small, high window near the ceiling, a maintenance hatch that led to the hospital's loading docks. "One more crawl, buddy," she whispered. She boosted Boomer up toward the hatch, the dog scrambling with a desperate, quiet intensity. She followed him, her fingers clawing at the metal, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pulled herself into the narrow, dark tunnel of the vent just as the server room door was blown off its hinges. She didn't look back. She crawled through the dust and the dark, the sound of the soldiers below her fading into a distant, muffled roar. She reached the end of the vent and kicked the grate open. She was outside. The Nevada sun was finally over the horizon, a blinding, white-hot disk that turned the desert into a sea of fire. She dropped to the pavement of the loading dock, Boomer landing beside her. They were in a shadow, hidden behind a row of industrial dumpsters. Across the parking lot, she could see the black Tahoes and the unmarked vans of the program. They were everywhere. The base was a fortress, and she was a ghost trapped inside the walls. She looked at the dog. He was limping, his tail tucked, his eyes reflecting the harsh light of the morning. "We're not going to make it out the front gate, are we?" she whispered. Boomer didn't wag his tail. He just looked at her with that quiet, ancient intelligence, his head cocked to the side as if he were listening to a sound she couldn't hear. Then Elena felt it. It wasn't a vibration in the ground. It wasn't a signal in the air. It was a heartbeat. She looked across the loading dock toward a parked ambulance, a civilian unit, not a military one. The engine was idling, the driver sitting inside, a young man with a tired face and a cup of coffee. On the door of the ambulance was the logo of a private medical transport company. And underneath the logo, scratched into the paint by a hand that knew what it was doing, was a tiny, elegant symbol. A hummingbird, but this one was different. It wasn't the white, clinical mark of the program. It was red, the color of blood, the color of a warning. Elena felt a cold chill settle in her gut. The war wasn't just inside the base, it was everywhere. It was in the infrastructure of the world itself. And she was standing right in the middle of the crosshairs. She gripped the Glock, her knuckles white. She looked at Boomer, and for the first time since Kandahar, she felt a flicker of real, unadulterated fear. Not for her life, but for what the world was becoming. The ambulance driver looked in the side mirror. His eyes met hers. He didn't scream. He didn't reach for a radio. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement, and reached over to open the passenger side door. Elena stood on the edge of the loading dock, the wind whipping her hair across her face. She had a choice. She could run into the desert and hope the sun would hide her, or she could step into the belly of the beast and see how deep the rabbit hole really went. She looked at the dog. "Ready?" Boomer gave a single, sharp woof. Elena Vance stepped off the dock and moved toward the open door, the shadow of the hummingbird falling across her as the first siren began to wail in the distance. A sound that signaled not an end, but a beginning. The door clicked shut behind them, and the ambulance pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the morning traffic of Las Vegas just as the first black helicopter rose over the perimeter fence of Nellie's, its searchlight cutting through the dust like the eye of a vengeful god. She was gone, but the signal was just getting louder. The ambulance smelled like industrial lavender and stale coffee, a scent that didn't belong to the sterilized death of the hospital or the ozone-burnt air of the server room. The driver, a man no older than 25 with a jagged scar running through his left eyebrow, didn't look at Elena as he threw the vehicle into gear. He drove with a frantic, twitchy precision, his eyes darting between the side mirrors and the digital clock on the dashboard. Elena didn't ask where they were going. She didn't ask who he was. She sat on the floor of the rig, her back against the gurney, the Glock 19 heavy and warm in her lap. Boomer was a dead weight against her thigh, his breathing shallow but steady. The dog's flank was matted with blood where the bullet had grazed him, a dark, ugly stripe against his black fur. 3 minutes, the driver said. His voice was a rasp, high-pitched with the kind of adrenaline that usually ended in a crash. 3 minutes before they realized the transponder on this rig is spoofed. "I'm Caleb. I was 25th ID, Signal Corps. I saw what you did at Creech. I saw the logs before they wiped the server." Elena didn't respond. She was busy. She had pulled a trauma kit from the wall cabinet and was ripping open a pack of sterile gauze with her teeth. Her hands were shaking, not with fear, but with the violent, rhythmic tremor of a brain that had been pushed past its structural limits. The world was tilting. To her left, the heart rate monitor on the wall was pulsing with a soft green light, but in Elena's mind it was a strobe light, each flash hitting her retinas like a physical blow. She could feel the ambulance's engine, the 6-liter Duramax diesel humming at a frequency that felt like a drill against her molars. She pressed the gauze to Boomer's wound. The dog flinched, a low whine escaping his throat, but he didn't pull away. He looked at her with eyes that were clear and trusting, even as the world around them dissolved into a chaotic smear of Nevada desert and morning sun. "The red hummingbird," Elena said, her voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Who are you working for, Caleb?" "The people who built the cage," Caleb said, swerving the ambulance onto the off-ramp for Highway 95, and realized too late they were the ones inside it. "There's a group. Former Signal, former Crypto. We've been tracking the resonance spikes for 18 months. We knew the program was testing a kinetic relay, but we didn't know they had achieved high-fidelity transfer until the Creech outage. You're the only person who's actually seen the physical rack, Vance. You're the only one who can prove it's not just a software glitch. I destroyed it, Elena said. Caleb let out a short, hysterical laugh. You destroyed one node. There are 12 more between here and the Hoover Dam. It's a mesh network. It's like a hydra. You cut off one head and the signal just reroutes through the remaining copper. They're using the entire southwest power corridor to broadcast. If they finish the upload, they won't need the base anymore. They'll be the base. There'll be every light bulb and every microwave in the country. Elena felt a surge of the cold, pressurized rage that had become her only anchor. She wasn't a politician. She wasn't a revolutionary. She was a warrant officer in the United States Air Force, and she had spent her life believing that the wires she guarded were the veins of her country. To see them turned into a weapon, to see the infrastructure she loved used as a garrote against the people she was sworn to protect, it felt like a personal betrayal. The ambulance suddenly lurched to the right. The sound of a heavy impact echoed through the thin metal skin of the vehicle, followed by the screech of tearing steel. "They're here," Caleb yelled. Elena didn't look out the window. She didn't have to. She felt the frequency of the pursuit vehicles before she saw them. Two black Chevy Suburbans, their engines tuned to a specific high-torque whine that bypassed standard mufflers. They weren't trying to pull them over. They were trying to PIT them to send the top-heavy ambulance rolling into the grit of the shoulder. "Keep it straight," Elena commanded. She stood up, her balance precarious as the ambulance swayed. She grabbed a heavy-duty nylon strap from the gurney and looped it around her waist, anchoring herself to the interior frame of the rig. The back windows of the ambulance shattered. A spray of safety glass rained down over Boomer, who let out a sharp, territorial bark. Elena didn't flinch. She saw the muzzle flashes from the lead Suburban, short, controlled bursts from suppressed carbines. They were aiming for the tires. "Caleb, the oxygen tanks!" Elena shouted over the roar of the wind. "What?" "The main supply, open the valves, all of them." She didn't wait for him to understand. She scrambled to the rear of the rig, her fingers fumbling with the heavy brass fittings of the M-sized oxygen cylinders. She opened the valves wide, the hiss of pressurized O2 filling the cabin in seconds. The air became rich, sweet, and incredibly volatile. She looked through the shattered rear doors. The lead Suburban was less than 10 feet away, the driver's face obscured by a tactical helmet and a dark visor. She saw the passenger leaning out, a short-barreled HK 416 leveled at the ambulance's rear axle. Elena didn't fire the Glock. Not yet. She waited for the resonance. She closed her eyes for a split second, letting the TBI-induced hypersensitivity map the space behind the vehicle. She felt the heat of the Suburban's engine. She felt the vibration of its tires on the asphalt. She felt the exact moment when the vehicle's front bumper aligned with the ambulance's rear step. She fired once. The bullet didn't hit the driver. It hit the road, a specific patch of asphalt she had identified through the vibration. The sparks from the impact ignited the cloud of pure oxygen venting from the back of the ambulance. The result wasn't a cinematic explosion. It was a localized, high-velocity flash fire. A wall of blue flame erupted between the two vehicles, a sudden, violent expansion of heat that sucked the air out of the Suburban's intake and blinded the driver. The black SUV swerved violently to the left, its tires screaming as it lost traction. It hit the center median at 60 miles per hour, flipped twice, and disintegrated in a cloud of dust and debris. "One down," Caleb screamed, his voice cracking, but the second Suburban was already moving. It didn't slow down to check on its teammates. It accelerated, coming up on the passenger side, the driver trying to squeeze the ambulance toward the steep embankment on the right. Elena felt the pressure in her head spike. The hummingbird signal was getting stronger. It wasn't just in the wires anymore. It was in the air, a low-frequency pulse that was beginning to override her own neural pathways. Her vision began to flicker, not like a light bulb, but like a digital video feed with a low bitrate. The edges of the world were pixelating into gray and white noise. "Vance, they are hitting us with an EW pulse," Caleb yelled. "The electronics are dying." The ambulance's dashboard went dark. The engine began to sputter, the electronic fuel injection system failing as the high-intensity electromagnetic field washed over the vehicle. This was the cost. This was the moment where the program stopped playing by the rules of physics and started using the grid as a scalpel. They were broadcasting a localized jammer through the power lines that ran parallel to the highway. Elena felt the seizure coming. It started as a metallic taste on the back of her tongue, followed by a sudden, terrifying coldness in her extremities. Her brain was being shorted out by the very signal she was tuned to. "Boomer, anchor!" The dog didn't hesitate. Despite his wound, he lunged forward and pressed his entire weight against Elena's chest, pinning her against the wall of the ambulance. The physical pressure, the grounding of another living being, was the only thing that kept her from sliding into a grand mal. She locked her teeth, her jaw muscles screaming, and forced her eyes to stay open. She didn't look at the Suburban. She looked at the power lines. She saw it. Not with her eyes, but with the dark competence that had been forged in the fire of Kandahar. She saw the way the energy was flowing, a jagged, pulsing current that was being modulated to create the jamming field. It was beautiful in its lethality. It was a symphony of destruction, and she knew how to break the rhythm. "Caleb, the bridge, the one with the transformer bank. I see it, half a mile. Don't slow down. If the engine dies, coast it through." Elena reached for her spectrum analyzer. It was a useless piece of junk now, its screen shattered, but she didn't need the electronics. She needed the copper. She ripped the internal coils out of the casing, her fingers bleeding as the sharp metal edges sliced her skin. She twisted the wires together, creating a crude, high-gain antenna. She tied the wire to the end of a heavy-duty pry bar she found in the tool kit. The Suburban was inches away now. The side window of the SUV rolled down, and a man in a tactical vest pointed a flashbang launcher at the ambulance's interior. "Now!" Elena screamed. She didn't jump. She leaned out of the shattered rear doors, her body anchored only by the nylon strap and Boomer's weight. She swung the pry bar with everything she had, not at the Suburban, but at the low-hanging guide wire of the power lines they were passing under. The pry bar, trailing its tail of copper wire, caught the line. For a microsecond, Elena Vance became the bridge. The current didn't hit her. The nylon strap and the rubber soles of her boots provided just enough insulation to keep her heart from stopping. But the resonance did. Thousands of volts of modulated data surged through the wire and into the ambulance's frame. The ambulance became a massive, rolling capacitor. The electronic warfare pulse being emitted by the program's Suburban hit the ambulance's newly energized hull and reflected. It didn't just jam the SUV, it fried it. The Suburban's entire electrical system detonated. The airbags deployed, the horn began to blare a continuous, dying note, and smoke poured from the dashboard. The SUV veered off the road, crashing into a stand of Joshua trees in a spectacular spray of sand and twisted metal. Elena fell back into the ambulance, her lungs burning, her vision almost entirely gone. She felt Boomer licking her face, his tongue warm and rough. She tried to speak, but her vocal cords were paralyzed by the residual charge. The ambulance coasted to a halt. The engine was dead. The world was silent except for the ticking of cooling metal and the distant, rhythmic thrum of the desert wind. "Vance, Vance, talk to me." Caleb was over her, his face a blur of shadow and light. He was checking her pulse, his hands shaking so hard he could barely find the vein. "I'm okay," Elena managed to whisper. The word felt like a jagged stone in her throat. She sat up, the movement causing a wave of nausea so intense she had to lean over and vomit onto the floor. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and looked at Boomer. The dog was standing over her, his ears back, his tail giving a single tentative wag. He was hurting, but he was alive. They were 5 miles outside of Henderson. The sun was fully up now, turning the desert into a shimmering kiln of heat. Elena looked back toward Nellie's. She could see the dust clouds on the horizon, more vehicles, more helicopters. The reckoning wasn't coming, it was already here. "We have to move," Caleb said, his voice urgent. "The ambulance is a beacon. They'll have satellite tracking on the VIN. We have to ditch it." "Where?" Elena asked. "There's a drainage tunnel 300 yards to the east. It leads into the storm drain system for the suburbs. It's the only place they can't see us from the air." Elena looked at Boomer. The dog's limp was more pronounced now, his movements stiff. She looked at her own hands, which were covered in a map of fine, red burns from the copper wire. This was the cost. They were 2 broken soldiers and a wounded dog, standing in the middle of a desert, hunted by the very government they had served. "Move," Elena said. They abandoned the ambulance. Elena took the Glock, the trauma kit, and a gallon of water. Caleb took a heavy backpack filled with what he called the evidence. Hard drives and printouts he had smuggled out of the signal center. The walk to the drainage tunnel was the longest 300 yards of Elena's life. Every step felt like a needle being driven into her brain. The sun was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, and the ground seemed to vibrate with the lingering echoes of the hummingbird's signal. They reached the tunnel, a massive concrete maw that smelled of damp earth and rot. It was a relief to be out of the sun, but the darkness brought its own terrors. Elena's TBI made the shadows dance and stretch, creating monsters out of discarded trash and old graffiti. They moved deep into the tunnel until the light from the entrance was just a small, white coin in the distance. "We'll wait here," Caleb said, dropping his pack. "They'll be looking for us on the surface. They won't expect us to go into the drains." Elena sat down, pulling Boomer into her lap. She felt the dog's heart beating against her own, a steady, rhythmic pulse that was the only real thing in a world of ghosts. "Caleb," she said after a long silence. "Yeah, why did you come for me? You didn't know me. You could have just stayed in your office and let it happen." Caleb sat against the opposite wall, his silhouette barely visible in the gloom. He was quiet for a long time. "My brother was at Creech," he said finally. "He was a contractor, one of the guys who worked in the sub-basement. When the Hummingbird first went live, the test run 6 months ago, he was the one who reported the resonance. He said the sound was making him sick. He said he could hear the wires talking." Elena's heart tightened. "What happened to him?" "They said he had a mental breakdown. They committed him to a private facility in California. 3 weeks later, they said he committed suicide. But I saw the body, Vance. He didn't have any marks on him. No rope burns, no pill residue. He just looked empty, like someone had turned off the lights inside him." Caleb looked up, his eyes catching a stray glint of light. "When I saw your file, when I saw that you were hearing the same things he heard, I knew I couldn't let it happen again. You're not crazy, Elena. You're just the only one who can hear the lie." Elena reached out and touched the concrete wall of the tunnel. She felt the vibration, faint but unmistakable. The program wasn't giving up. They were pushing the signal harder now, using the grid to sweep for her. It was a searchlight made of energy, and she was the only thing in its path. "They're coming for us, aren't they?" Caleb asked. "They're already here," Elena said. She stood up, her vision clearing for the first time since the hospital. The dark competence was back, but it was different now. It wasn't just training anymore. It was a fusion of her broken brain and her iron will. She could feel the signal, yes, but she could also feel the asterisk-shape asterisk of it. She could see the holes in the mesh. "We're not going to hide," Elena said. "What, Vance, there are dozens of them. They have tactical teams, air support." "They have technology," Elena interrupted. "They have a signal that they think they control, but they don't understand it. They think it's a tool. They don't realize it's an echo." She looked at Caleb, her eyes hard and cold. "We're going to the Meade substation." "The Meade, that's the main hub for the entire Pacific Intertie. It's one of the most heavily guarded facilities in the country." "It's also where the Hummingbird is nesting," Elena said. "If we can get to the main bus bar, I can use the resonance to backfeed the signal. I won't just destroy the node. I'll destroy the source. I'll burn the program out of the grid." Caleb stared at her. He saw the burns on her hands, the blood on her suit, and the terrifying, focused light in her eyes. He realized then that he wasn't looking at a victim of the program. He was looking at their nemesis. "It's a suicide mission," he whispered. "It's the mission," Elena corrected. She looked at Boomer. The dog stood up, his tail giving a firm, rhythmic thump against the concrete. He was ready. They spent the next 4 hours moving through the storm drains. It was a subterranean odyssey, a journey through the bowels of a city that had no idea its lifeblood was being poisoned. Elena led the way, using her sense of the resonance to navigate the labyrinth. She didn't need a compass. She just followed the sound of the enemy. The pressure was constant. Every time they passed under a major power line, Elena would stumble, her brain spasming under the weight of the data. But she didn't stop. She used the pain to gauge their distance. The louder the signal, the closer they were to the heart. They emerged from a manhole 3 miles from the Meade substation just as the sun began to set. The facility was a sprawling forest of steel and porcelain, surrounded by layers of electrified fencing and motion sensors. Black-clad guards patrolled the perimeter with Belgian Malinois, their flashlights cutting through the twilight. "We can't get through that," Caleb said, peering over the edge of a concrete culvert. "There's a thermal sweep every 30 seconds. Elena watched the patrol patterns. She saw the guards, the cameras, the dogs. But she also saw the things they couldn't see. She saw the way the air shimmered around the high-voltage transformers. She saw the ghosts of the signal dancing on the wires. "We're not going through the gate," Elena said. She reached into the trauma kit and pulled out a roll of heavy-duty medical tape and 2 packets of saline. She handed them to Caleb. "I need you to create a diversion. That drainage pipe 50 yards to the left, it leads directly to the cooling pond. If you can short out the sensor array with the saline, the system will trigger a level 1 alarm. All the guards will move to the pond." "And you?" Caleb asked. "I'm going to use the bus bar," Elena said. She looked at him, and for a brief moment the controlled woman vanished, replaced by something deeply, painfully human. She reached out and squeezed Caleb's hand. "Thank you, Caleb, for believing me." Caleb swallowed hard. "Don't die, Vance. I don't want to have to tell my brother's story alone." He moved off into the shadows, a ghost in a tactical vest. Elena looked at Boomer. "Stay with him, buddy. Keep him safe." The dog looked at her, his eyes wide and pleading. He didn't want to leave her. He knew what she was planning, and he knew the cost. "Go," Elena whispered. Boomer hesitated for a heartbeat, then turned and followed Caleb. Elena was alone. She waited until she heard the first scream of the siren, a high, piercing wail that tore through the desert silence. She saw the guards at the main gate scramble, their flashlights converging on the cooling pond. The spotlights swung away from the main transformer bank, leaving a narrow, dark corridor in the center of the facility. Elena moved. She didn't run. She moved with a slow, predatory grace, her body low to the ground. She bypassed the motion sensors by timing her movements with the skip in the power grid. She knew the frequency of the sensors, and she knew the exact moment when the hummingbird signal would create a blind spot. She reached the main bus bar, a massive, humming assembly of copper and steel that stood 20 feet high. The air here was thick with the smell of ozone, and the vibration was so intense it made her vision blur and her teeth ache. She climbed the ladder. Every rung was a struggle. Her muscles were cramping, her TBI-induced vertigo making the ground spin beneath her, but she kept going. She reached the top platform, directly beneath the 3-phase power lines that carried the energy for half the state. She stood up. The wind was whipping around her, the sky above a deep, bruising purple. She looked at the hummingbird transmitter, a small black box attached to the side of the bus bar, its white light hummingbird logo pulsing with a rhythmic, sickening glow. This was it, the moment of maximum pressure. Elena reached out to touch the box, but before she could, a voice cut through the roar of the electricity. "I knew you'd come here, Elena. You always were predictable when it came to the mission." She didn't turn around. She knew the voice. Colonel Holloway was standing on the opposite platform, his face illuminated by the blue arc light of the transformers. He looked different, older, more haggard. He was holding a remote detonator in his hand. "I'm not predictable, Colonel," Elena said, her voice steady despite the roar in her head. "I'm just thorough. Step away from the transmitter, Elena. If you touch that bus bar, you'll be vaporized. The resonance is at peak capacity. The upload is 98% complete." "I'm not going to touch it," Elena said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the one thing she had kept from the server room at Nellie's, the silver-plated capacitor. "I'm going to change the frequency," she said. Holloway's eyes widened. "You can't. The encryption is too deep. You don't have the key." "I don't need the key," Elena said. "I am the key." She didn't hesitate. She stepped forward and pressed the capacitor directly against the main bus bar while simultaneously gripping the hummingbird transmitter with her other hand. The world didn't just explode, it shattered. The electricity didn't just flow through her, it rewrote her. For a split second, Elena Vance wasn't a woman anymore. She was a signal. She was every bit of data, every pulse of energy, every echo of the program. She saw everything. She saw the faces of the people the program was spying on. She saw the encrypted files, the secret budgets, the names of the men who had ordered her father's silence. And she sent it all back. She used her own brain, her broken, hypersensitive, extraordinary brain, as a filter. She stripped the hummingbird virus of its encryption and broadcast the raw, ugly truth back into the grid. Across the country, screens flickered to life. In the Pentagon, in the NSA, in every newsroom from New York to Los Angeles, the data began to pour out. The program's secrets, their crimes, their perfect signal. It was all there, laid bare for the world to see. The feedback was catastrophic. The hummingbird, transmitter in Elena's hand, disintegrated in a shower of sparks. The bus bar groaned, the metal warping under the intensity of the back feed. Holloway screamed as the remote detonator in his hand exploded, the feedback traveling through the radio link and into the device. He fell from the platform, disappearing into the dark more of the facility below. Elena felt her heart stop. She felt the darkness closing in, the sound of the world fading into a single pure note. She was falling, her body a weightless fragment in a sea of light. And then she felt a hand. It wasn't a soldier's hand. It wasn't Holloway's hand. It was Boomer. The dog had bypassed the guards, bypassed the sensors, and had climbed the maintenance stairs to the top of the platform. He grabbed Elena's flight suit in his teeth and pulled her back from the edge of the bus bar, his weight the only thing keeping her from the abyss. Elena gasped, her lungs suddenly filling with air. She felt the cold metal of the platform against her back. She felt the warmth of the dog's fur. The facility was silent. The hummingbird signal was gone. The lights of the substation were dark, the entire Southwest power grid having suffered a strategic shutdown. The mission was complete. Elena lay there for a long time, watching the stars begin to emerge in the desert sky. She felt empty. She felt broken. But for the first time in 3 years, the noise in her head was gone. The wires were silent. She heard footsteps on the stairs. Caleb appeared, his face streaked with soot and tears. He ran to her side, his hands trembling as he checked her pulse. "You did it, Vance. You actually did it. The data is everywhere. It's on the front page of every major site. They can't hide it anymore." Elena didn't speak. She didn't have the strength. She just looked at Boomer, who was sitting beside her, his head resting on her shoulder. They stayed there for the first few minutes of the aftermath. Below them, they could see the headlights of the tactical teams approaching, the sirens of the local police, the flashlights of the guards. The reckoning was here, and there would be no escaping it. Elena knew what was coming. She knew the court-martials, the hearings, the long, slow death of her career. She knew that the institution she had loved would never forgive her for what she had done. But as she looked at Caleb and Boomer, she knew something else. She was right. And in a world built on lies, that was the most expensive thing a person could be. Elena Vance closed her eyes, the sound of the approaching helicopters, a distant, harmless hum. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't running. She was standing her ground. Even if she was doing it from the floor of a darkened substation, with a wounded dog and a broken brain, she was still standing. The light from the first helicopter searchlight hit the platform, turning the world white. Elena didn't flinch. She just waited for the world to catch up to the truth. The fluorescent light in room 402 of the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center didn't just hum. It vibrated at a precise 60 hertz, a frequency Elena Vance could feel in the marrow of her teeth. She lay perfectly still on the thin, sanitized mattress, her eyes fixed on a hairline crack in the ceiling tiles that looked vaguely like the coastline of Maine. It was 03:14 on a Tuesday, exactly 4 days after the Meade substation had gone dark. And for the first time in 3 years, the screaming in her head had been replaced by a heavy, pressurized silence. She was handcuffed to the bed rail by her left wrist, a standard grade 4 restraint, cold and unforgiving against her skin. They had told her it was for her own protection, a lie that tasted like the copper and charcoal she'd been vomiting since the surgery. The door didn't creak when it opened. It moved with the silent, oiled precision of a high-security facility. Elena didn't turn her head. She didn't need to. She felt the displacement of air, the specific weight of a man who spent his life carrying the burden of other people's secrets. The smell reached her first, unscented soap, starch, and the faint, lingering acidity of a man who drank too much coffee and slept too little. It was Brigadier General Marcus Thorne. She had seen him once at a distance during a briefing at Langley, a man whose reputation was built on the quiet disposal of inconvenient truths. Thorne didn't speak for a long time. He pulled a heavy plastic chair to the side of the bed, the legs scraping against the linoleum with a sound that made Elena's vision flicker. He sat, his movements economical, and placed a thick manila folder on his lap. The folder was stamped with a red top secret //psi header, the ink still looking fresh and wet in the harsh overhead light. "You've caused a significant amount of paperwork, Warrant Officer," Thorne said. His voice was a low, melodic baritone that didn't match the hardness in his eyes. Elena remained focused on the crack in the ceiling. Her jaw was tight, the muscles corded like wire. She could feel the dark competence still lurking in the back of her mind, a caged animal looking for an exit, but her body was a ruin. The burns on her hands were wrapped in silver sulfadiazine-soaked bandages, and her brain felt like it had been scrubbed with steel wool. The upload reached 74 nodes before the grid collapsed. Thorne continued, his voice devoid of any readable emotion. By the time we got the secondary firewalls up, the data was already being mirrored on 400 servers across 3 continents. You didn't just leak a program, Vance. You gutted the SIGINT architecture of the United States for the next decade. Do you have any idea what that costs? In dollars? In lives? Elena finally turned her head. The movement sent a spike of white-hot pain through her neck, but she didn't flinch. She looked Thorne in the eye, her gaze as cold and level as a sniper's scope. "It cost my father his life," she said, her voice a dry rasp. "It cost the men at Creech their sanity, and it was going to cost every citizen in this country their privacy. I'd say the price was already paid, I just settled the debt." Thorne leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "You're a soldier, not a martyr. You took an oath to the chain of command." "I took an oath to the Constitution," Elena corrected. "The chain of command broke the link first." The general looked at her for a long beat, searching for a crack, a sign of the mental instability the official report was already being drafted to highlight. He found nothing but the unwavering focus of a woman who had seen the bottom of the world and decided she liked the view. He sighed, a sound of genuine weariness, and opened the folder. "Colonel Holloway survived the fall," Thorne said. "He's in a secure wing at Fort Meade, multiple fractures, internal hemorrhaging. He's claiming you suffered a psychotic break brought on by your TBI and that he was attempting to restrain you when the substation was sabotaged." "Sabotaged," Elena repeated, the word sounding like a joke. "Is that what we're calling it?" "That's what the press release says. An extremist cell targeted the grid. You were a first responder who went above and beyond, but ultimately succumbed to the trauma of the event. We can make you a hero, Elena. We can give you the Silver Star, a full medical retirement, and a quiet life in Montana or wherever it is women like you go to disappear. All you have to do is sign the addendum." He pulled a single sheet of paper from the folder. It was a non-disclosure agreement, so comprehensive it practically demanded she forget her own name. It acknowledged that the Hummingbird data was a localized simulation gone wrong, a training glitch that she had misinterpreted due to her injury. It was a document designed to erase the last 3 years of her life. Elena looked at the paper, then at the handcuff on her wrist. The institution was moving, its gears grinding to smooth over the jagged edges she had created. They weren't trying to punish her yet, they were trying to absorb her. They were trying to turn her act of rebellion into a manageable bureaucratic error. "Where is Caleb?" she asked. Thorne's expression didn't change. "Corporal Caleb Miller is being processed at Nellie's. He's facing charges of desertion, theft of government property, and treason. He doesn't have your protection. He isn't a war hero with a traumatic brain injury. He's just a signal tech who stole an ambulance." The pressure in Elena's chest tightened. This was the leverage. This was how the machinery worked. They wouldn't break her, they would break the people who believed in her until she broke herself to save them. And the dog. A brief, almost imperceptible flicker of something, discomfort, passed over Thorne's face. The animal was injured. He's with the veterinary corps at Andrews. He's stable, but he's being held as evidence. Evidence of what? Elena's voice dropped an octave, the controlled exterior beginning to smoke at the edges. "He's a dog. He saved my life. He's a piece of military hardware that was present at the scene of a national security breach," Thorne said, standing up. "The choice is yours, Vance. You sign the addendum and the charges against Miller are reduced to a dishonorable discharge and time served. The dog gets returned to you. You get your hero's exit, or we go to trial. And I promise you, by the time the JAG is done with you, the world will believe you're a paranoid schizophrenic who tried to plunge the country into darkness." He left the paper on her bedside table, next to a plastic cup of lukewarm water and a stack of gauze. The door clicked shut, the sound echoing in the small room like a gavel. Elena lay back, the 60 hertz hum of the light filling the silence. The cost was arriving in full. It wasn't just the physical pain or the lost career. It was the realization that the truth she had bled for was being traded like a commodity in a backroom deal. She looked at her bandaged hands. She could still feel the phantom vibration of the bus bar, the moment when she had been a bridge for the lightning. She had thought that by revealing the truth, she would change the world. She hadn't realized that the world's first instinct would be to hide the truth in a basement. 2 floors down, in a windowless briefing room that smelled of stale air and floor wax, the reckoning for the men who had ignored Elena Vance was taking place in a much quieter, more clinical fashion. Major General Arthur Sterling, the man who had overseen the Hummingbird budget for 3 years, sat at the head of a mahogany table. Across from him were 4 men from the Senate Intelligence Committee. They weren't yelling. There were no dramatic accusations. There was just the relentless, monotone reading of the data logs Elena had released. "The report says she warned you. one of the senators said, a man from Virginia with a voice like gravel. It says she flagged the resonance spikes in January, then again in March, and then she was reassigned to a server room in the basement of Nellie's. Why? Sterling, a man whose uniform was so crisp it looked like it was made of tempered steel, didn't blink. Warrant Officer Vance was suffering from a documented traumatic brain injury. Her reports were considered symptomatic of her condition. We followed standard medical and security protocols. Standard protocols, the senator repeated, leaning forward. General, because of your standard protocols, the encrypted identities of 6,000 undercover assets are currently being sold on the dark web. The Hummingbird program didn't just spy on civilians. It created a backdoor that the Chinese and Russians are currently using to walk through our entire power grid. This wasn't a glitch. It was a catastrophic failure of leadership. Sterling looked down at his hands. For a brief second, the mask of the high-ranking officer slipped, and the man underneath looked small. He had spent 30 years building a career on the idea of managed risk, and now he was realizing that the risk had never been managed at all. It had just been ignored. She was right, Sterling said, his voice barely a whisper. What was that, General? She was right, Sterling said, louder this time, his voice cracking. Vance. She saw the resonance. She told us exactly what would happen if the upload hit the high-fidelity phase. We thought the injury had changed her. We didn't want to believe that a warrant officer with a broken brain could see something our entire analytical suite missed. The room went silent. It was the sound of a career ending. Not with a bang, but with the quiet admission that a woman they had dismissed as broken had been the only one who was actually whole. You're relieved, Arthur, the senator said, his voice almost gentle. There will be a formal inquiry, but for now you need to go home. Sterling stood up. He walked out of the room, his boots hitting the floor with a rhythmic, hollow sound. He passed a mirror in the hallway and stopped. He looked at the medals on his chest, the stars on his shoulders, and for the first time in his life they felt like costume jewelry. He thought about Elena Vance, handcuffed to a bed in the hospital next door, and he felt a wave of nausea so intense he had to lean against the wall. He had been her commander. He had been responsible for her, and he had treated her like a faulty piece of equipment. Back in room 402, the door opened again. This time it wasn't a general. It was a woman in a lab coat, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, carrying a tray of medications. She moved with a practiced clinical detachment, but as she reached Elena's bedside, she paused. She looked at the NDA sitting on the table, then at Elena. They're moving you at 0600, the nurse whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the light. Elena's eyes sharpened. Moving me where? Level 5 psychiatric wing at Fort Bragg. They've already processed the transfer orders. They're classifying you as a danger to yourself and others. Elena felt the cold bloom of real fear. Fort Bragg's psych wing was where people went when the military wanted them to disappear without the mess of a court-martial. It was a black hole of heavy sedation and observation that could last for years. Why are you telling me this? Elena asked. The nurse leaned in closer, pretending to check Elena's Roman 4 line. My son was at Creech. He was one of the techs who didn't make it out when the cooling system failed. He used to call me and tell me that the air felt like it was buzzing. He said nobody would listen to him. Then he died, and they told me it was an industrial accident. She looked Elena in the eye, and for a second the clinical mask dissolved into raw, jagged grief. You're the only one who told the truth. Don't let them take it back. The nurse reached into the pocket of her lab coat and slid something onto the bed, hidden beneath the folds of the sheet. It was a small, plastic-encased key, the key to the Grade 4 restraints. The security detail changes at 0400, the nurse said, her voice trembling. There's a 90-second window when the hallway cameras loop during the server handoff. The service elevator at the end of the hall leads to the loading docks. There's a laundry truck that leaves at 04:15. She didn't wait for a thank you. She picked up her tray and walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing until they were swallowed by the silence of the hospital. Elena felt the weight of the key against her thigh. Her heart began to race, a frantic, thudding rhythm that she forced herself to control. This was the dark competence again, the narrowing of the world until only the mission remained. But the mission had changed. It wasn't about the wires anymore. It was about survival. She waited. The minutes crawled by, measured by the rhythmic pulsing of the heart rate monitor. She used the time to visualize the path. She had studied the blueprints of Walter Reed during her recovery, a habit born of a lifetime of tactical thinking. She knew the service elevator was old, a hydraulic model that would be slow but silent. She knew the loading docks were staffed by civilians who wouldn't be looking for a wounded Air Force officer in a hospital gown. At 03:58, she heard the muffled voices of the security detail in the hallway. "Yeah, I'm headed down to the cafeteria. You want anything? Just black coffee and a bagel if they have the onion ones." "You got it. See you in 10. The footsteps receded. Elena didn't waste a second. She reached under the sheet, her bandaged fingers fumbling with the small plastic key. The lock on the handcuff was a simple mechanism, but her hands were stiff and the pain was a constant, distracting roar. Asterisk click. Asterisk the restraint fell away from her wrist. She sat up, the world spinning violently as her TBI reacted to the sudden change in posture. She gripped the edge of the bed, her knuckles white, and waited for the vertigo to pass. She was wearing a standard-issue hospital gown and a pair of non-slip socks. She looked at the NDA on the table, the document that promised her a hero's exit in exchange for her soul. She picked it up, crumpled it into a ball, and dropped it into the trash can. She stood up. Her legs felt like they were made of water, and the burns on her feet hissed as they touched the cold floor. She moved to the closet and found her personal effects, the bag they had taken from her when she was admitted. Inside was her flight suit, scorched and torn, and her boots. She pulled them on, the familiar weight of the leather providing a small measure of stability. She didn't have her weapon. She didn't have her dog. She didn't have Caleb, but as she stood in the center of the room, she felt a strange, terrifying sense of clarity. She was Elena Vance, and she was no longer part of the machine. She reached the door and pressed her ear to the wood. Silence, she opened it an inch. The hallway was bathed in the dim, red glow of the nightlights. The cameras at the far end were stationary, their green power lights blinking in unison. Asterisk now. Asterisk, she slipped out of the room, her movements a shadow against the wall. She moved with a limping, frantic grace, her breath shallow and controlled. Every sound, the hum of the vending machine, the distant hiss of the HVAC, felt like a gunshot in the silence. She reached the service elevator. She pressed the button, the small light illuminating her face. She looked at herself in the polished metal of the doors. She looked like a ghost. Her skin was pale, her eyes sunken, a jagged scar running from her temple into her hairline. But the eyes were still hers. They were still the eyes of the woman who had stood on the bus bar and told the lightning where to go. The elevator arrived with a soft asterisk ding asterisk. She stepped inside and pressed the button for the basement. As the doors began to close, she heard a shout from the end of the hallway. "Hey, room 402 is open." The doors shut and the elevator began its slow, agonizingly deliberate descent. Elena slumped against the wall, her lungs burning. She could hear the sirens starting upstairs. The code silver that meant a high-value prisoner had escaped. They would be at the loading docks in minutes. They would have the perimeter sealed before she could reach the gate. The elevator reached the basement. The doors opened to a cavernous, concrete space filled with the smell of laundry detergent and diesel exhaust. A large, white truck was backed into Bay 3, its rear doors open as two men tossed bags of soiled linens into the hold. Elena didn't think. She ran. She scrambled into the back of the truck, burying herself deep beneath a pile of heavy, damp sheets. The smell was overwhelming, bleach and sweat and the metallic tang of hospital waste, but she welcomed it. It was the smell of the world. A moment later, the truck's engine roared to life. The vehicle bucked as the driver threw it into gear, and Elena felt the lurch of movement as they pulled away from the dock. She lay there in the dark, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was out. But as the truck hit the first bump on the road out of the facility, the weight of what she had left behind settled onto her like a shroud. She had left Boomer. The thought was a physical blow, sharper than any of the injuries she had sustained. She could still see the dog's eyes as she had told him to go with Caleb. She could feel the ghost of his head on her shoulder. She had spent her whole life being loyal to the mission. But in the end, the only thing that had been loyal to her was a wounded Belgian Malinois who didn't care about frequencies or protocols. She closed her eyes, the tears finally coming, hot and silent, as the truck moved through the streets of Washington, D.C. She was a fugitive, a traitor, a hero, and a ghost. And she was alone. 20 miles away at a secure military kennel at Andrews Air Force Base, Boomer lay in a cage that was too small for him. His flank was stitched and bandaged, and he was wearing a plastic cone that made it impossible for him to rest his head comfortably. He wasn't barking. He wasn't whining. He sat perfectly still, his ears twitching at every sound, his nose pressed against the chain-link gate. A young airman, a girl with a soft face and a name tag that read *Harris*, walked by with a bowl of water. She stopped at Boomer's cage and looked at him, her expression filled with a pity that the dog didn't want and didn't understand. "I'm sorry, boy," she whispered, sliding the bowl under the gate. "I know you're waiting for her, but she's not coming back. They said she did something bad." Boomer didn't look at the water. He didn't look at the girl. He looked at the door at the end of the kennel, the door where people came in and out. He remembered the smell of ozone. He remembered the sound of the wind on the platform, and he remembered the heartbeat of the woman who had saved him. He lowered his head, a low, guttural growl vibrating in his chest. He wasn't just waiting. He was listening. And in the silence of the kennel, far beneath the roar of the jet engines taking off from the runway, he could still hear the faint, rhythmic hum of the world. In a different part of the city, Caleb Miller sat in a windowless room that felt like a tomb. He had been in the same chair for 18 hours. His hands were cuffed behind his back, and his vision was blurry from the single, high-intensity bulb hanging from the ceiling. The door opened, and a man in a civilian suit walked in. He wasn't a soldier. He was agency, the kind of man who didn't have a name, only a function. He sat across from Caleb and placed a digital recorder on the table. "Let's try this again, Corporal," the man said. "Who gave you the coordinates for the Meade substation?" Caleb looked at the man, his face a mask of bruised exhaustion. He had been beaten during the arrest, a standard resistance incident that had left him with a broken nose and a swollen eye, but he didn't feel the pain. He only felt a strange, defiant sense of pride. "I told you," Caleb said, his voice thick with blood. "I followed the signal." "Signals don't give coordinates, Miller. They give data. Someone told you where to meet Vance. Someone in the Signal Corps. Give us a name and we can talk about a plea deal. You have a mother in Ohio, don't you? A sister. Do you want them to see you in a jumpsuit for the rest of your life?" Caleb thought about the ambulance ride. He thought about Elena Vance standing in the back of the rig, her body anchored by a nylon strap, firing into the road to create a wall of fire. He thought about the way she had looked at him in the storm drain, not as a corporal, but as a partner. "Her name is Elena Vance," Caleb said. "We know her name, you idiot. We want the others." "There are no others," Caleb said, a small, bloody smile touching his lips. "It was just us. A broken warrant officer, a deserter, and a dog, and we took down your whole goddamn playpen. How does that feel?" The man in the suit didn't respond. He reached out and turned off the recorder. He stood up, walked over to Caleb, and hit him once, a short, sharp blow to the stomach that sent the corporal reeling. "She's gone, Miller," the man whispered into Caleb's ear. "She escaped an hour ago, but she won't get far. We have her face on every camera in the eastern seaboard, and when we find her, we're going to make sure she never sees the sun again. And you're going to be the one who testifies that she forced you to do it. You're going to be the nail in her coffin." He walked out, leaving Caleb alone in the dark. Caleb gasped for air, the pain in his ribs a sharp, hot needle, but through the pain he felt a surge of hope. Asterisk, she escaped. Asterisk, he didn't know how, and he didn't know where she was, but she was out there. The woman who could hear the wires was free. The institutional response was now in its secondary phase, the erasure. At the Pentagon, the Hummingbird files were being systematically purged from the active servers. The hard drives were being degaussed, the paper trails shredded, the personnel reassigned to remote posts in Alaska and Guam. The official narrative was hardening into concrete. Elena Vance was a rogue actor. The data leak was a sophisticated foreign cyber attack that had coincidentally happened at the same time as her breakdown. The truth was being buried under layers of plausible deniability and national security exemptions. But the machine had a flaw. The flaw was a man named Captain David Reed, the officer who had signed Elena's reassignment papers back in Part 1. He was sitting in his office at Nellie's, watching the sunset over the desert. On his desk was a copy of the sabotage report Thorne had mentioned. Reed was a by-the-book officer. He believed in the institution. He believed in the chain of command. But he also believed in the data, and the data in the report didn't add up. He had seen the logs Elena had tried to give him. He had seen the resonance she had warned him about. And now, as he looked at the wreckage of the Meade substation on the news, he realized that the sabotage had happened exactly where she said the node would be. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small, encrypted thumb drive. It was a copy of the data Elena had tried to hand him on that first day. The data he had refused to look at because he was afraid of what it would do to his career. He plugged it into his secure terminal. The screen filled with the jagged, pulsing lines of the Hummingbird frequency. He watched as the patterns shifted, the data modulating in a way that looked less like code and more like a heartbeat. He saw the spikes she had flagged. He saw the warning she had written in the margins of the code. "My God," he whispered. He realized then that he wasn't just looking at a leak. He was looking at a map of a ghost. The program was still there, lurking in the backup grid, waiting for someone to turn the lights back on. Elena hadn't destroyed it, she had only wounded it, and then he saw the final entry in the log, a timestamp from 4 hours ago. Asterisk signal detected, 14, 2 megahertz, source, mobile, encryption, Vance 01. Asterisk, she was still broadcasting. Elena wasn't running to hide, she was running to finish it. Reed looked at the screen, his heart pounding. He had a choice. He could report the signal to his superiors and finalize the erasure of Elena Vance. He could be the one who brought her in and secured his promotion to major, or he could do the one thing he had never done in his 15 years of service. He could listen. He reached out and tapped a command into the terminal, a command that would mask the signal from the base's automated sweeps. He wasn't helping her yet. He wasn't a rebel. But as he watched the green dot pulse on the map, moving slowly toward the Virginia coastline, he felt a sudden, sharp pang of shame. He had been the one who had dismissed her. He had been the one who had looked at her extraordinary capability and called it a disability. He had been part of the machine that had tried to crush her. "Good luck, Vance," he whispered to the empty room. The personal cost of the last 4 days was etched into Elena's face as she stepped out of the laundry truck in a quiet industrial park in Alexandria. The morning sun was just beginning to hit the tops of the trees, a pale, cold light that offered no warmth. She was shivering, her body finally beginning to crash from the adrenaline and the trauma. She looked down at her hands. The bandages were gray with road grime, and the skin beneath was a raw, angry red. She had lost her career. She had lost her dog. She had lost her country. She walked toward a row of storage units, her boots clicking on the asphalt. She reached Unit 412 and entered a code into the keypad. The door rolled up with a heavy metallic groan. Inside was a single, dusty motorcycle, a 2018 Kawasaki KLR 650, and a locker filled with gear she had stashed there years ago, back when she still thought the world was a predictable place. She had always been thorough. She had always had a backup plan. She stripped off the hospital gown and the charred flight suit. She looked at her body in the small, cracked mirror on the wall. She was covered in bruises, the purple-black blooms of the crash, the yellowing marks of the struggle on the platform. She looked like she had been put through a meat grinder. She pulled on a pair of jeans, a black hoodie, and a leather jacket. The weight of the clothes felt like armor. She reached into the back of the locker and pulled out a small, waterproof case. Inside was a customized spectrum analyzer, the one she had built herself before the TBI, before the Hummingbird. It was her masterpiece, a device that could hear things the military's multi-million-dollar rigs couldn't even dream of. She turned it on. The screen flickered to life, the familiar green lines dancing across the display. She tuned it to 14, 2 megahertz. The hum was there, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't a signal from the program. It was the signal from the grid itself. The resonance that was still pulsing through the wires of the East Coast. The program was trying to restart. She could feel it in the air, a low-frequency pressure that was building in her head. They were using the Norfolk Naval Base as the new hub. They were going to try again, and this time they wouldn't make the mistake of leaving a witness. Elena sat on the floor of the storage unit, her back against the cool metal wall. She closed her eyes and let the noise in. She didn't fight it this time. She didn't try to filter it. She let the dark competence take over, letting the signal map the world for her. She saw the wires. She saw the towers. She saw the secret cables running under the Chesapeake Bay. She saw the men in the dark rooms, their fingers hovering over the keys. She knew what she had to do. It wouldn't be like the substation. There would be no dramatic explosion, no wall of blue flame. This would be a surgical strike, a digital assassination that would burn the Hummingbird out of the architecture forever. But it would require her to go back inside. She stood up and pushed the motorcycle out of the unit. The engine turned over on the third try, a throaty, mechanical roar that felt like a challenge to the silent world around her. She looked at the road ahead. She was one woman on a 20-year-old bike, hunted by the most powerful military on Earth, her brain a ticking time bomb of neurological damage. The odds weren't just bad, they were non-existent. But she didn't care about the odds. She didn't care about the cost. She thought about Boomer in his cage. She thought about Caleb in his cell. She thought about her father's silent grave. She kicked the bike into gear and twisted the throttle. As she pulled out of the industrial park, a black Suburban turned the corner 2 blocks away. It didn't have its sirens on. It didn't have its lights. It just followed, a silent, predatory shape in her rearview mirror. Elena didn't speed up. She didn't try to evade. She knew they were there. She wanted them to be there. She was leading them to the end of the line. She reached the bridge over the Potomac. The city of Washington spread out before her like a map of a dying empire. The monuments looked like headstones in the morning mist. She felt the hummingbird's signal spike, a sharp, stabbing pain behind her eyes. They were trying to jam her. They were trying to use the signal to trigger another seizure, to send her and the bike careening over the side of the bridge. Elena gripped the handlebars, her knuckles white. She leaned into the wind, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Not today," she whispered. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small, silver-plated object. It wasn't a weapon. It was the original hummingbird prototype, the one her father had built in their garage 20 years ago. The one she had kept hidden all these years, a secret that had cost her everything. She held it in her hand, the metal cold and familiar. She knew the frequency. She knew the code, and she knew that when she turned it on, there would be no going back. The Suburban was closing the gap now, its front bumper inches from her rear tire. She could see the men inside, the tactical helmets, the dark visors, the cold, professional faces of the men who were just doing their jobs. Elena Vance looked at the silver prototype, then at the city before her. She was right. She had always been right, and now she was going to prove it one last time. She thumbed the switch on the prototype. The world didn't change. The sun didn't stop shining. The birds didn't stop singing. But for a split second, every light in the city of Washington, D.C., flickered. Every phone screen went dark. Every radio emitted a single, pure note of 14, 2 megahertz. It was the sound of the truth breaking through. And then the silence returned. Elena twisted the throttle and disappeared into the morning mist, the black Suburban swerving as its electronic control module suddenly and inexplicably fried. She was heading for Norfolk. She was heading for the heart of the machine. And as she rode, she didn't feel the pain. She didn't feel the fear. She only felt the hum. The reckoning was far from over. It was just entering its final, most lethal phase. At the Norfolk Naval Station, inside a bunker 30 feet below the waterline, a technician looked at his screen and frowned. "Sir, we've got a resonance spike on the primary bus. It looks like a Vance 01 encryption." The officer behind him, a man who had been told Elena Vance was dead, went pale. "Trace it," the officer commanded. "I can't, sir. It's coming from everywhere. It's like the whole grid is talking at once." The officer looked at the monitor, his hand trembling as he reached for the red phone on his desk. "Get me General Thorne," he said. "Tell him the hummingbird is home." Elena rode on, the wind whipping past her, the ghost of a wounded dog running beside her in the shadows of the road. She didn't know if she would survive the next hour. She didn't know if anyone would ever believe the story she was about to tell with her life. But she knew one thing. The wires were finally, beautifully, dangerously silent. The wind coming off the Elizabeth River smelled of salt, diesel, and the slow, inevitable rot of low-tide marshes. Elena shifted her weight on the Kawasaki, the engine's rhythmic thrumming vibrating through her thighs and into the base of her spine. She was bypassing the main gates of Naval Station Norfolk, sticking to the service roads that skirted the edge of the shipyard, where the massive, skeletal forms of aircraft carriers sat in dry dock like sleeping leviathans. Her vision was tunneling, the edges of the world fraying into static every time she blinked, but the dark competence kept her hands steady on the grips. She wasn't just riding a motorcycle. She was navigating a map of invisible frequencies that only she could see, a glowing grid of telemetry and surveillance that she was weaving herself through like a needle. She stopped at a gas station on the edge of Willoughby Spit, a sun-bleached shell station where the linoleum was peeling and the air smelled of stale coffee and industrial-grade floor wax. She didn't buy gas. She walked into the restroom, her boots heavy and hollow on the floor, and stared at herself in the rusted mirror. The woman looking back was a stranger. Her face was a topographical map of trauma, the scar on her temple a jagged ridge, her eyes bloodshot and sunken, the skin of her hands a raw, weeping landscape of second-degree burns. She looked like something that had survived a fire only to realize the world outside was just as cold. She took a roll of duct tape and a bottle of high-proof rubbing alcohol from her jacket pocket. She didn't let herself hesitate. She poured the alcohol over her hands, the pain a white-hot scream that she trapped behind her teeth, her jaw muscles bulging until they felt like they would snap. She didn't cry. She didn't make a sound. She just watched the clear liquid turn pink as it washed over the raw flesh, the scent of the spirits filling the cramped, tile-walled room. Then she began to rap. She wound the tape tight over the gauze, over the burns, over the history of the last 4 days until her hands were stiff, black-armored tools. She couldn't feel her fingers anymore. That was the point. Feeling was a luxury she had traded for the mission. When she stepped back outside, the sun was a bruised orange, hanging low over the Chesapeake Bay. She could feel the hummingbird now. It wasn't a distant hum anymore. It was a physical weight, a localized pressure centered on the naval station's communications hub, a windowless concrete monolith known as Building 17. They were spinning it up. The resonance was reaching a critical mass, a feedback loop that would soon bridge the gap between the military's secret servers and the public infrastructure of the entire eastern seaboard. If it hit the peak, the data wouldn't just be leaked. It would be fused into the very architecture of the internet, a permanent, unerasable backdoor for anyone with the right frequency to walk through. She reached Building 17 at 1942. The security was tight, triple-strand concertina wire, infrared cameras, and a squad of shore patrolmen with M4s slung across their chests. They were looking for a fugitive warrant officer in a hospital gown. They weren't looking for the ghost that Elena had become. She parked the bike a half-mile away in the shadow of a warehouse and moved on foot, her silhouette blending into the industrial clutter of the docks. She didn't use the doors. She used the ventilation shafts, the cold metal of the ductwork, a familiar sanctuary. She moved with the silent, practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent half her life in the crawl spaces of the machine. The air inside the ducts was thin and smelled of ozone and computer coolant, a scent that triggered a flash of memory. Her father's workshop, the sound of a soldering iron, the quiet pride in his eyes when she had first identified a carrier wave. She pushed the memory down. Memory was a distraction. She dropped into the server room on the 4th floor, the floor vibrating with the roar of 1,000 cooling fans. The room was a labyrinth of black towers, their status lights blinking in a rhythmic, hypnotic pattern. In the center of the room sat the hub, the localized core of the Hummingbird program. It was a sleek, silver cylinder, looking more like a piece of art than a weapon of mass surveillance. And standing in front of it was Brigadier General Marcus Thorne. He didn't look surprised to see her. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his uniform immaculate, the stars on his shoulders catching the blue light of the servers. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a late guest. "You're late, Elena," he said, his voice easily carrying over the roar of the fans. Elena stepped out of the shadows, her black-taped hands held at her sides. She didn't have a gun, she didn't need one. The traffic was bad. Thorne smiled, a thin, humorless thing. "You look terrible. You should have stayed at Walter Reed. We could have made it easy for you." "Easy isn't in my job description," Elena said. She moved toward the terminal, her boots clicking on the raised floor tiles. "Shut it down, Marcus. The resonance is hitting the 40 hertz threshold. In 10 minutes, the loop becomes self-sustaining. You won't be able to turn it off even if you want to." "I don't want to turn it off," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a low, melodic baritone. "The Hummingbird isn't just a program, Elena. It's the future. It's the end of uncertainty. No more hidden cells, no more secret agendas. We can see the signal before the noise even starts. Do you have any idea what that means for national security?" "It means you're turning the country into a panopticon," Elena said, her eyes fixed on the monitor. "And you're doing it with a frequency that's burning out the brains of the people who run it. My father died because of this code. The men at Creech are vegetables because of this code. It's not a tool, it's a cancer." "Progress always has a cost," Thorne said, stepping closer. "Your father understood that. He was a visionary. He just didn't have the stomach for the implementation. But you're the bridge, Elena. You're the only one who can actually hear the architecture. We don't want to kill you. We want to study you. We want to know how your brain adapted to the frequency." The controlled rage finally broke through the surface. It didn't manifest as a scream or a strike. It manifested as a sudden, terrifying stillness in Elena's eyes. She looked at Thorne, and for the first time in his life, the general felt a cold prickle of genuine fear. "My brain didn't adapt," Elena whispered. "It broke, and now I'm going to break yours." She didn't go for the general, she went for the hub. She reached into her jacket and pulled out the silver prototype, the one her father had built. She slammed it into the interface port of the silver cylinder. The machine hissed, a plume of blue sparks erupting from the connection. "What are you doing?" Thorne shouted, reaching for the sidearm at his hip. "I'm grounding the loop," Elena said, her voice steady even as her vision began to pulse with white light. "I'm the only thing in this room with a high-fidelity connection to the grid. I'm going to anchor the resonance to my own neural pathway, and then I'm going to overload the source code. It'll kill you, Thorne yelled, his hand freezing on the grip of his pistol. Maybe, Elena said, but it'll definitely kill the program. She closed her eyes and reached out. She didn't use her hands. She used the extraordinary hidden capability that had been both her gift and her curse. She opened the doors in her mind, the ones she had spent 3 years trying to keep shut. The signal hit her like a physical blow. It was a wall of sound, a billion voices, a trillion data points, all screaming in a single, unified frequency. She felt her heart stop, then restart in a frantic, irregular rhythm. She felt the copper taste of the lightning in her mouth. She felt her memories being stripped away, the smell of Montana pine, the sound of her mother's voice, the feeling of Boomer's fur under her hand, as the data surged through her brain, looking for a place to hide. She didn't fight it. She became the conduit. She channeled the entire weight of the Hummingbird program through her own consciousness and directed it back into the hub. The room exploded into light. The servers began to scream, their cooling fans spinning at impossible speeds before shattering. The blue status lights turned a violent, angry red, then went dark. The silver cylinder in the center of the room began to glow, the metal turning a dull, cherry orange as the circuitry inside melted. Thorne was thrown back by the pressure wave, his body hitting a server rack with a sickening thud. Elena stood in the center of the storm, her hair whipping around her face, her eyes wide and glowing with an unnatural electric light. She wasn't a woman anymore. She was a bridge. She was the lightning. And then, with a sound like 1,000 glass bells shattering at once, the signal died. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, pressurized void that seemed to swallow the light and the air. Elena collapsed to the floor, her body a limp, broken thing. The silver prototype fell from her hand, its metal casing blackened and twisted. The hub was dead. The Hummingbird was gone. Thorne crawled to his feet, his face bloody, his uniform torn. He looked at the wreckage of his career, the smoking remains of the most sophisticated surveillance program ever created, and then he looked at Elena. She was lying on her back, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. She wasn't moving, she wasn't breathing. You fool," Thorne rasped, his voice trembling. "You have no idea what you've done." He reached for his radio, his fingers fumbling with the switch. "Security, Building 17, we have a breach. I need medical now." He looked back at Elena, expecting to see the vacant stare of a corpse. But as the first teams of shore patrolmen burst through the doors, Elena's eyes moved. She looked at Thorne, and a single bloody tear tracked down her cheek. She wasn't dead, but the hum was gone. For the first time in 3 years, the world was silent. The aftermath was a blur of antiseptic rooms and quiet, high-stakes negotiations. Elena was moved to a secure facility at Fort Belvoir, a place where the walls were lead-lined and the doctors didn't have names, only security clearances. She was charged with 64 counts of treason, sabotage, and the unauthorized release of classified data. The JAG officers arrived in waves, their briefcases filled with documents that promised her a life sentence at Leavenworth. They spoke in the dry, rhythmic language of the law, their voices devoid of any acknowledgement of what she had actually done. Elena didn't speak. She sat in the center of the windowless room, her hands bandaged in clean white gauze, her eyes fixed on the wall. She didn't beg. She didn't explain. She didn't offer the hero's defense they were expecting. She waited. She knew the cost was still being calculated. She knew the institution was trying to decide if it was safer to kill her or to hide her. The answer came on a rainy Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the Norfolk incident. The door to her room opened, and a man walked in. He wasn't a general. He wasn't a lawyer. He was a man in a rumpled suit carrying a cardboard box. It was Captain David Reed, the man from Nellie's who had finally decided to listen. He sat across from her and placed the box on the table. "The charges have been dropped, Elena," he said, his voice quiet and tired. Elena didn't react. "Why?" "Because General Thorne is being forced into early retirement, and because Major General Sterling gave a statement to the Senate Intelligence Committee before he was relieved. He told them the truth, all of it. The resonance, the TBI, the fact that you warned them for 3 years. Reed looked at her, his eyes filled with a complicated mix of guilt and admiration. "The official story is that you were part of a classified stress test of the grid. Your actions at the Meade substation and Norfolk are being recorded as heroic interventions during a systemic failure. You're getting a full medical discharge, 100% disability." "And Caleb?" Elena asked, her voice a dry rasp. Corporal Miller has been reinstated. He's being transferred to a drone comms unit in Germany. It's a quiet post. He'll be fine. Reed reached into the box and pulled out a small, leather-bound folder. He slid it across the table. This is for you. It's the paperwork for your retirement. And this. He reached back into the box and pulled out a heavy metal object. It was a leash. The Veterinary Corps cleared him this morning, Reed said, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. He's waiting in the transport van downstairs. Elena's hand trembled as she reached out and touched the cold metal of the leash. For the first time in the entire ordeal, the controlled exterior cracked. A small, jagged breath escaped her lips, a sound of relief so deep it felt like a physical weight leaving her chest. "Thank you, David," she whispered. "Don't thank me," Reed said, standing up. "I'm the one who didn't believe you. I'm the one who let this happen. If anyone should be thanking anyone, it's the rest of us. You saved the world, Elena, and nobody is ever going to know your name." "That's the way I like it," she said. She walked out of the facility an hour later, the rain cold and refreshing against her face. She didn't look back at the cameras, or the guards, or the institution that had tried to consume her. She walked toward the white transport van parked at the curb. The side door opened, and a blur of tawny fur exploded out of the darkness. Boomer hit her like a freight train, his tail thudding against her legs, his tongue a wet, frantic force against her face. He was limping, a scar running down his flank where the shrapnel had hit him, but his eyes were bright and full of a fierce, unwavering loyalty. Elena buried her face in his neck, her hands tangling in the thick fur. She didn't cry, she didn't need to. The dog knew, he had always known. "Hey, boy," she whispered, "let's go home." The road to Billings, Montana, was a long, quiet stretch of asphalt that wound through the heart of a country that was still there, still breathing, still oblivious to how close it had come to the edge. Elena drove a beat-up Ford F-150 she had bought with her back pay, the windows down, the smell of the planes filling the cab. Boomer sat in the passenger seat, his head out the window, his ears flapping in the wind. The hummingbird was gone. The wires were just wires. The air was just air. But as Elena looked out at the horizon, she realized that the cost wasn't just physical. Her brain was different now. The silence wasn't perfect. Sometimes when she was tired or when the weather was turning, she could still hear a faint, ghostly echo of the frequency, a memory of the lightning that had lived inside her. She was a warrant officer no longer. She was a woman who knew too much, living in a world that wanted to know nothing. She reached the small cabin her father had left her, a modest place on the edge of a pine-covered ridge, miles from the nearest power line. She stepped out of the truck, the silence of the mountains settling over her like a heavy blanket. She walked to the edge of the porch and looked out at the valley. The sun was setting, the sky a deep, bruised purple. In the distance, she could see the lights of a small town, a handful of glowing embers in the darkness. She knew that somewhere out there, in a windowless room in D.C., or a bunker in Virginia, the machine was already rebuilding. Someone else would find the frequency. Someone else would try to bridge the gap. The struggle wasn't over, it was just resting. But as she stood there, her hand resting on Boomer's head, she felt a small, quiet spark of hope. She had proven that the machine could be broken. She had proven that one woman with a broken brain and a loyal dog could stand in the path of the lightning and tell it to go home. She went inside and closed the door. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't turn on the radio. She sat in the dark and listened to the sound of the wind in the trees and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the dog at her feet. She was Elena Vance. She was alone. She was whole. The next morning, she woke up before the sun. She made a cup of coffee and sat on the porch, watching the mist rise off the valley floor. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, silver object, the only piece of the prototype she had been able to salvage from the wreckage of Building 17. It was a simple soldering iron tip, blackened and warped by the heat. She held it in her palm, the metal cold and heavy. She thought about her father. She thought about the men at Creech. She thought about Caleb, somewhere in Germany, watching the monitors and wondering if she was still out there. She stood up and walked to the edge of the ridge. She looked out at the vast, uncaring beauty of the American West, a landscape that didn't care about frequencies or protocols or national security. She threw the piece of metal as far as she could. She watched it arc through the air, a tiny silver flash in the morning light, before it disappeared into the deep green shadows of the pines. She turned back to the cabin, her footsteps light on the dry earth. She had paid the cost. She had finished the mission. And for the first time in her life, the only thing she had to listen to was the sound of her own heart. The report would say she was a tragedy, a broken soldier who had succumbed to the weight of her own mind. The report would say she was a cautionary tale about the limits of human endurance. The report was wrong. Elena Vance walked into the cabin and started the fire, the crackle of the wood the only frequency that mattered. The world was quiet. She was free. The silence lasted for 3 years. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 1,095 days since she had walked out of Fort Belvoir, when the change happened. Elena was in the small garden she had built behind the cabin, her hands covered in the rich, dark soil of the Montana mountains. She was planting heirloom tomatoes, the sun warm on the back of her neck, the world a peaceful, sensory-driven reality. Boomer was lying in the shade of the porch, his eyes half closed, his tail occasionally thumping the wood as he chased dreams of rabbits. Then the dog's ears twitched. He didn't bark. He didn't stand up. He just sat up, his head cocked to the side, his nose twitching as he sampled the air. Elena felt it a second later. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a vibration. It was a sudden, sharp change in the atmospheric pressure, a localized hollow in the air that felt like the beginning of a thunderstorm. She stood up, her heart beginning to thud against her ribs. She looked at the sky, but there were no clouds. She looked at the valley, but the wind was still. And then she heard it. It was a low-frequency hum, so faint it was almost a memory, vibrating at exactly 14. 2 megahertz. She closed her eyes, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't want to hear it. She had spent 3 years building a life out of the silence, a life out of the dirt and the wood and the dog. But the hummingbird was back. It wasn't coming from the grid. It wasn't coming from a server in Norfolk. It was coming from a black SUV that was currently winding its way up the dirt track toward her cabin. Elena didn't run. She didn't go for the shotgun she kept under the bed. She just stood in her garden, her dirt-stained hands hanging at her sides, and watched as the vehicle pulled into the clearing. The driver's side door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was young, maybe 25, wearing a crisp civilian suit and a pair of sunglasses that hid her eyes. She moved with the stiff, practiced grace of someone who had spent her life in the halls of Langley. The woman walked toward the garden, her heels clicking on the stones. She stopped at the edge of the fence and looked at Elena. "Warrant Officer Vance?" the woman asked, her voice clear and professional. "I don't go by that anymore," Elena said, her voice a dry rasp she hadn't used in days. "My name is Agent Sarah Miller," the woman said. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a leather-bound folder. "I'm with the Office of Naval Intelligence. We've been looking for you for a long time." "I wasn't hiding," Elena said. "No," Agent Miller agreed. "You weren't, but you were quiet, and the world isn't quiet anymore." She opened the folder and held out a photograph. It was a satellite image of a facility in the middle of the Nevada desert, a place Elena recognized instantly. It was the black site where the hummingbird prototype had first been tested. In the center of the image was a massive, glowing crater. "It happened 6 hours ago," Miller said. "A resonance spike triggered a catastrophic failure in the primary bus. The entire facility was vaporized. The signature was a Vance 01 encryption." Elena looked at the photo, the dark competence beginning to stir in the back of her mind like a hibernating animal. "That's impossible. I destroyed the source code." "You destroyed the military's version," Miller said, stepping closer. "But someone found your father's original notes, someone in the private sector. They've been building a shadow grid for the last 2 years, Elena, and they've lost control of it." She looked Elena in the eye, and for the first time the professional mask slipped. Elena saw the fear, the raw, jagged terror of a person who had seen the bottom of the world and realized it was still falling. "It's not just Nevada," Miller whispered. "The resonance is spreading. It's hitting the 60 hertz threshold. If we don't ground the signal in the next 48 hours, the entire national grid is going to detonate. Not just the data. The hardware. Every substation, every transformer, every power line in the country." Elena looked at the garden. She looked at the tomatoes. She looked at Boomer, who was now standing by her side, his fur bristling, his eyes fixed on the black SUV. She thought about the silence she had worked so hard to earn. She thought about the cost she had already paid. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you're the only one who can hear it," Miller said. "And you're the only one who knows how to kill it." Elena looked at the black-taped scars on her hands, the history of the last 3 years written in the raw, uneven flesh. She knew what they were asking. They weren't asking for her help. They were asking for her life. They were asking her to become the bridge one last time. She looked up at the mountains, the sun just beginning to dip behind the peaks. She thought about the loyalty she felt to the mission. Not the mission of the military or the mission of the government, but the mission of her father. The mission to protect the people from the things they couldn't see. She turned back to the cabin. "I need my boots," she said. The ride back to the world was a blur of high-speed jets and windowless rooms. They took her to a facility in Virginia, a place hidden beneath a shopping mall in Arlington. It was a cathedral of technology, a place where the air hummed with the sound of 1,000 cooling fans and the light was always a cold, surgical blue. They had everything ready. The interface, the telemetry, the dark suite of analytical tools. And sitting in the center of the room, looking older and more tired than she remembered, was Marcus Thorne. He didn't have his uniform on. He was wearing a gray sweater and a pair of slacks, looking like a retired professor. He stood up when she entered the room, his eyes searching hers for a sign of the woman he had tried to break. "Elena," he said, his voice a low, melodic baritone. "General," she replied. "I'm sorry," he said. "I tried to stop them. The private contractors, they didn't understand the resonance. They thought they could cage the lightning." "You can't cage a ghost, Marcus," Elena said. She walked toward the primary terminal, her movements economical and precise. She didn't need a briefing. She didn't need to see the data. She could feel the signal in the marrow of her teeth, a sharp, stabbing pressure that was building with every second. She reached out and touched the screen. The hummingbird was different this time. It was bigger, more aggressive. It had been fed on the raw, unfiltered data of the private sector, a diet of consumer habits and financial telemetry that had turned the program into a digital predator. It wasn't just spying. It was feeding. "It's a feedback loop," Elena said, her eyes narrowing. "It's using the grid to amplify its own frequency. Every time a light is turned on, the program gets stronger." "How do we stop it?" Thorne asked. Elena looked at the monitor, then at her own hands. She knew the answer. She had always known the answer. "We don't," she said. "We ground it, but we can't use a physical anchor this time. The resonance is too high. It would just melt the hardware." "Then what?" Elena looked at Thorne, and for a second the controlled exterior dissolved into something raw and human. "We use a biological anchor. We use the only thing in the world that can process the frequency in real time." Thorne went pale. "No, Elena, that will literally fry your nervous system. You won't survive the upload." "I survived the last one," she said. "Barely, and that was a localized hub. This is the entire grid. It's like trying to drink the ocean through a straw." "Then I guess I'm going to be very thirsty," Elena said. She sat in the interface chair, the leather cold against her back. They began to attach the electrodes, the small, silver discs that would bridge the gap between her brain and the machine. She looked at the door. Boomer was standing there, held back by 2 security guards. He wasn't barking. He was watching her, his eyes filled with a quiet, devastating understanding. "Let him in," Elena said. The guards looked at Thorne. Thorne nodded. The dog walked into the room, his tail low, his head down. He walked to the side of the chair and laid his head on Elena's lap. She reached down and buried her fingers in his fur, the familiar scent of the Montana pines clinging to his coat. "It's okay, boy," she whispered. "I'm just going to listen for a while." She looked at Agent Miller, who was standing at the control console, her hand hovering over the engage button. "Do it," Elena said. The world disappeared. It wasn't like the last time. It wasn't a wall of sound. It was a world of light. Elena felt herself being pulled out of her body, her consciousness expanding until it touched every corner of the country. She was in the wires. She was in the towers. She was in the phones and the computers and the smart fridges of 300 million people. She saw it all. She saw the secrets. She saw the lies. She saw the quiet, beautiful moments of a billion lives. The first steps of a baby in Ohio, the last breath of an old man in Florida, the laughter of a girl in a park in Seattle. She saw the hummingbird for what it really was, not a weapon, but a reflection. It was the collective weight of human existence translated into code, and it was too much. She felt her brain beginning to melt, the heat of the data searing through her synapses. She felt her heart stop, her lungs freeze. She began to scream, but there was no sound. She reached out, her consciousness searching for the source, the Vance 01 core that was driving the loop. She found it in a server room in the basement of a bank in Manhattan. She didn't try to delete it. She loved it. She poured her own life, her own memories, her own love for the world into the code. She gave the hummingbird the one thing it didn't have, a soul. She gave it the smell of Montana pine. She gave it the sound of her father's voice. She gave it the feeling of a dog's head on her lap, and the resonance changed. The sharp, stabbing frequency began to modulate. It began to hum, a low, melodic baritone that sounded like a lullaby. The lights in the facility began to dim. The servers began to slow down. The hummingbird didn't die. It went asleep. Elena felt herself falling, the world of light fading into a deep, pressurized darkness. She felt her heart restart, a slow, thudding rhythm that felt like a gift. She opened her eyes. She was back in the room. The blue light was gone. The fans were silent. Boomer was still there, his head on her lap, his tail thumping softly against the chair. Thorne was leaning over her, his face a mask of disbelief. "You did it. Elena, you actually did it. The grid is stable. The program is, it's dormant." Elena didn't speak. She couldn't. Her tongue felt like a piece of lead in her mouth. She looked at her hands. The black tape was gone, replaced by thin, white scars that looked like the branches of a tree. She had paid the final cost. She didn't know if she could still hear the wires. She didn't know if she could still see the grid. But as she looked at Boomer, she realized that she didn't care. The silence was back, and this time it was permanent. The resolution was quiet. There were no medals. There were no public ceremonies. The hummingbird incident was classified as a major network glitch, a temporary inconvenience caused by a solar flare. Elena was given a new name, a new social security number, and a check for $2 million. She didn't take the money. She took the truck. She took the dog. And she took the silver prototype, which she had managed to reclaim from the wreckage of the facility. She didn't go back to Montana. She went to a small town on the coast of Maine, a place where the air smelled of salt and the only frequencies were the cries of the gulls and the rhythmic crashing of the waves. She bought a small cottage on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic. She spent her days walking on the beach with Boomer, her hands in her pockets, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She was a ghost again, but she was a happy ghost. She still had the controlled exterior, the quiet, disciplined grace of a woman who had seen the end of the world and decided she liked the view. But there was something else there now, a softness, a lightness that she hadn't felt since she was a little girl. The dark competence was gone. The hummingbird was gone. She was just Elena. One evening, as the sun was setting over the water, she sat on her porch with a cup of tea. Boomer was lying at her feet, his nose twitching as he sampled the salt air. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her father's prototype. She looked at it for a long time, the metal catching the last of the light. She knew that somewhere out there the world was still spinning. The machine was still building. The wires were still humming. But for the first time in her life, she didn't have to listen. She stood up and walked to the edge of the cliff. She looked out at the vast, uncaring beauty of the ocean, a landscape that didn't care about frequencies or protocols or national security. She didn't throw the prototype this time. She walked back to the cabin and placed it on the mantel, next to a photograph of her father and a small, dried flower from her garden in Montana. She went inside and closed the door. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't turn on the radio. She sat in the dark and listened to the sound of the ocean and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the dog at her feet. She was home. And as she closed her eyes, she realized that the silence wasn't a void. It was a choice. It was the most important choice she had ever made. The world was still there, but she was no longer its bridge. She was just a woman in a quiet house on a quiet cliff in a country that would never know her name. And that was more than enough. In the years that followed, the story of Elena Vance became a myth among the Sigint community, a story told in hushed tones over drinks at the Bird and Cage or in the quiet corners of the Pentagon. They called her the ghost of the grid. They whispered about the woman who had heard the lightning and lived to tell the tale. But Elena didn't hear the whispers. She was too busy living. She spent her winters in Maine, reading books and walking the dog. She spent her summers traveling the country in her old Ford, staying in small towns and eating in quiet diners where nobody knew who she was. She saw the country she had saved. She saw the people she had protected. She saw the beauty and the mess and the quiet, ordinary miracle of life in America. And every time she saw a power line or a cell tower or a satellite dish, she would smile a small, secret smile. She knew the truth. She knew that the world was built on a foundation of invisible frequencies, a web of signals that could be both a weapon and a gift. But she also knew that the most important signal wasn't code. It was the sound of a heartbeat. It was the feeling of a loyal hand on a loyal head. It was the knowledge that some things are worth more than security. Elena Vance was 84 years old when she finally decided the mission was over. She was sitting on her porch in Maine, watching the sun set over the water. Boomer was long gone, his place taken by a series of equally loyal dogs, the latest a golden retriever named Scout. She felt the hum one last time. It wasn't the hummingbird. It wasn't the grid. It was the sound of the universe itself, a low, melodic baritone that sounded like a song she had known her whole life. She closed her eyes and let the music in. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't tired, she was just ready. She reached out and touched Scout's head, her hand trembling but sure. "It's okay, boy," she whispered. "I'm just going to listen for a while." She leaned back in her chair and watched the stars come out, a billion tiny points of light in the infinite darkness. She knew that somewhere out there, a young woman was sitting in a server room, listening to the wires and wondering if she was the only one who could hear the resonance. Elena smiled. She wasn't the only one. She had never been the only one. She was just the one who had survived. She closed her eyes, and the silence finally became perfect. The last thing she felt was the cold Maine wind on her face and the warm weight of the dog at her feet. The mission was complete. The cost had been paid in full, and the world, for all its noise and all its secrets, was finally, beautifully, dangerously still. On the mantel of the cottage, the silver prototype sat in the moonlight, its metal surface dull and scratched, its secrets buried forever in the dust of a life well lived. The report would say she died of natural causes. The report would say she was a retired schoolteacher from Montana who had lived a quiet, unremarkable life. The report was right. Elena Vance was finally exactly who she was meant to be. The ocean continued to crash against the cliffs, the rhythm of the waves a frequency that would never need a bridge. The stars continued to shine, their light a signal that would never need a code. And in the silence of the Maine night, the only thing that remained was the truth. It was a truth that didn't need a name. It was just there, in the way the wind moved through the trees, in the way the tide pulled at the shore, in the way a woman had stood in the path of the lightning and told it to go home. The story of Elena Vance was over, but the silence she had earned would last forever. She was gone, but the world she had saved was still breathing, and that was the only medal she had ever wanted. Scout let out a low, mournful whine and rested his head on the empty chair. The light in the cottage went out. The stars moved across the sky. The world turned. Everything costs something, but some things are worth the price.